I lived in Wisconsin and worked at a covert restaurant when I had this horrible experience. At the time, I had an old clunker for a car. It would get me to and from work, sure, but it was one of those cars that every time you drove it, you just knew something was eventually going to happen. You always just hoped that when it did, it was going to be nice outside at least. Of course, that's never how it actually works out. The day I finally had the problem with my car, it was definitely not a nice day. It had been snowing hard all day long, and the ride to work had been bad enough. This day just got worse and worse. While I was working the closing shift, I don't think the entire 9 hours I was at work the snow even slowed down once. It was just constant, even though the plows had been running all day long. They could only do so much before the roads just ended up covered once they left. We closed at 10 p.m. or so, and it took us another 45 minutes to clean up the store. There was one coworker and one manager with me. We locked up all the doors and then went our own ways. It felt quite good to get out of work finally. I knew it would feel even better to get home, but I was not looking forward to the journey there. I lived a good 10 miles away, and in these weather conditions that ride was going to take forever. I had only gotten about halfway there when the very worst thing happened. I blew a tire. I was panicked at first. I was worried I was going to wreck the car due to the lack of traction on the ice. Somehow, though, I managed to pull into the parking lot of a nearby office building. Although I did have a spare, I didn't have a jack or anything to get the lug nuts off the tire apparently. Yeah, I know it's stupid, but I always thought I'd have the time to get those things if I ever needed them. Now I had no idea what I was going to do. There was no way I could just walk home, and I definitely couldn't leave my car here either. Even if I could call a taxi, if I left my car there it might get towed away, and I just could not afford a towing fee right now. I tried my best to get a hold of some friends, but nobody was answering their phone that day. I waited there in my car for a while, just watching the snow fall and wondering what I could do in this situation. I wasn't in the parking lot for more than 15 minutes when an SUV pulled off the road and drove over to me. I was immediately worried I was about to get in some trouble for idling in the parking lot, but I was also hopeful this was just someone trying to help me. A big, husky, bearish-looking man climbed out of this SUV and walked up to my car. He knocked gently on the window, and I rolled it down. "Hey there, need some help changing a tire?" the burly man said. "Yeah, I don't have any jacks or tools on me. I do have the tire, though," I explained to him. The man, as nice as could be, told me he had some tools and would be more than willing to help me change my tire. I'm not a particularly big guy myself, and I'd never had to do it before. This guy seemed thankfully genuinely willing to help me out. He went over to his SUV and got his tools. I thanked him profusely. As he began to change the tire, I got out of the car and stood behind him. I told him from now on I would get the tools, and if this ever happened again, I would be prepared from then on. While the man was explaining to me what to do, though, I caught something in the very corner of my eye. I didn't know what it was at first, but looking back towards that SUV, I saw the scariest thing I'd ever seen in my life. There was a person, bloodied up with duct tape over her mouth, trying to climb into the front of the car. Her hands were duct taped together as well, and her eyes were desperate for help. I was immediately scared to death. I didn't know what to do. It wasn't like I could fight this guy. He would tear me apart without even trying. I figured the only thing I could do was not let on that I just noticed her, and memorize his license plate number, call the police when he left. The rest of the tire change was just terrifying. I had no idea what that man was going to do with me. I didn't know if he was just trying to be helpful, or if he wanted to hurt me too. I tried my best not to look nervous, but every time he moved closer, I nearly jumped out of my skin. When he had finally changed the tire and began to lower the car back down, I reached into my pocket and grabbed my car keys. He picked up the jack and asked me to lean over and take a look. I really didn't want to do so, but I did it very slowly while making sure to keep an eye on him. When he saw how slowly I was moving, he picked up his tools and went over to put them in the back of his car. Immediately, I grabbed my keys out of my pocket, threw my door open, and slammed it shut. I looked in the mirror and saw the man had noticed me. He began to move quickly around the SUV. I turned on my own car. Thank God horror movie cliches don't happen in real life. My car started right away. I put it in gear and took off before the man could get to the side of my car. I pulled away, slipping more than once on the ice and almost sending my car spinning. Eventually, I did get away, and it was long before he had a chance to get into his SUV and follow me. I drove straight to the police station to tell them what I'd witnessed. While I was giving my statement, they sent the cars out to the parking lot. They found the girl still duct-taped and nearly naked, lying frozen and covered in snow in the parking lot. The man must have figured he'd gotten caught and dumped her. He probably hadn't figured I'd had the time to memorize his plate numbers. I'm very happy to report the police found him as well. I testified at his trial, and he went to prison. The woman turned out to actually be his girlfriend. She was very convinced he wanted to kill her, and very thankful to me that my tire had gone out that night, and I'd called the police to come help. I don't really know what I was thinking when I set up my classes and my living situation during my second year of college. My school had a huge campus, nearly 800 acres or so. I was a physics major, and I knew the building where all the physics classes were held. During my freshman year, I'd had to stay in a specific dorm which was built just for freshmen. This was in the middle of campus. As a sophomore, though, I could choose which building I wanted to stay in. I got into the honors dorm due to my 4.0 and chose to stay there for that year. It just so happened to also be on the far side away of campus from the building the physics classes were located in. The reason all of this is even relevant at all is I never took into account just how difficult it would be for me to get to my class and back to my dorm during the cold weather. Don't get me wrong, during the early fall and spring, it was really awesome to get all that exercise and get that good mood and the good weather. I lived in a very northern state, though, and it tended to get absolutely frigid in the late fall and all throughout winter. I also liked to sleep in a lot, so I would take as many classes as I could in the evening. You can guess what this led to. In late November, I was in the dorm room watching the news, and the weather said we were supposed to be getting quite a bad snowstorm that evening. Although I really did love being in class, I was really hoping that this evening they would be canceled, and I could just spend the evening alone in my room instead. Checking out the college's website, I was upset to find that classes were canceled, but only in the morning and the following day. Evening classes were not. I trudged my way over to class as the snowflakes fell all around me. I wasn't too shocked to see there were not a whole lot of other students out there with me. We had a huge enrollment, but most likely most were going to blow off this class. It was a regular class I'd upgraded to an honors class, so I really couldn't afford to miss this one. Interestingly enough, most of the other physics students I hadn't seen on my way there. There weren't more than 10 in the entire classroom. I sat down in the front and got settled in for a nice 2-hour lecture. There were no windows in that classroom, so I had absolutely no idea just how bad the snow was falling. I did have a good idea I was going to get some wet feet once I got back to my room, though. Once the class ended, the other students filed out, but I stayed behind and asked the professor a few clarifying questions. Once I was done, he left to go back to his office, and I was pretty much left all alone. I walked over to the door and looked out the tiny window frame on it. What I saw disheartened me greatly. The snow was loose and already knee-deep. It was also currently falling really hard. Visibility was crap. It was going to be a pain in the ass and a long walk to get back to my room. I kept looking out the window, trying to muster up my courage. before I finally figured it wasn't going to get any better just standing here. Putting the collar of my coat up and pulling down my hat, I went outside. It sucked immediately. Not only was it much, much colder than it had been on the way there, but the snow was actually stinging me as it hit my skin. It was like hurting my eyes so much I had to shade them. This made my already weakened visibility even worse. I had incorrectly assumed the snow was falling loose, and that's why it had piled up so much. In actuality, it was very difficult to walk through such compact snow. I was pretty much all alone as well. As I walked further towards the center of campus, I finally saw one other person walking outside as well. Up ahead, just on the walkway, there was someone standing underneath a light post. I could only make out their shadow really, since it was so hard to see. Whoever this person was though, they'd obviously noticed me too, and gave me what looked to be a friendly wave. I felt a little bit relieved to not be out here in this state alone. The person, who I assume was a student, was motioning for me to catch up with them. The wind and snow was still stinging my eyes. It was going to take a bit of effort to catch them. They were standing in the direction I was walking anyway though. As I got closer and closer trying to make out their features, the very first thing I noticed was that whoever it was not very big and had what looked like long curly hair. I figured this must be a girl or something. It looked like they were holding a purse, although it could have been a book bag as far as I knew. They kept on motioning for me to come closer and closer. This began to seem a little weird. As I squinted even further against the snow, I noticed that this mystery person was not standing there alone. There appeared to be a second person there, laying in the snow. I hadn't noticed at first because it was so deep. As soon as I saw that person, I put two and two together and realized why the shadow outline person kept on beckoning me. It seemed their friend must have fallen down in the snow and gotten hurt, and they needed my help to move them. Feeling mighty heroic, I began pushing harder and risking slipping myself when I actually heard the person on the ground call out for help. It seemed odd she was doing so. Her friend was literally right next to her. When I finally got close enough to make out the features of the person who was standing there though, I realized just why that girl was screaming for help. The guy was wearing a dark trench coat, and the curly hair was from a pullover clown mask he was wearing. He was standing on the legs of the girl who was laying on the ground. Feeling even more heroic spirit, I thought I must try and help this girl right now. She was obviously being held down by this clown. Who knew what he was going to do? I was not very big, but she was obviously hurt, and this might be the only chance she had to get away. When the man saw my concern, though, he surprised me and started to back away a bit. He put his hands up as if to show me he was innocent. I walked over to the girl. When I put my hand out to help her up, she uncovered her head and turned to look at me. My heart skipped a beat when I saw she was also wearing a clown mask. She pulled a knife out from under herself and actually stabbed me in the leg. I fell backward into the snow. I watched as she hopped up off the ground. I tried to get up to move, but I had forgotten about the clown that had backed off. He had actually slipped around behind me and grabbed me roughly, pulling me to my feet. Once I was up, he held one of my arms behind my back. The other he wrapped around my chest. The girl clown was now fully up as well. She moved close to me through the snow. I struggled to try and throw the clown behind me off, but I couldn't get any leverage with this slippery ground. As the girl clown came closer to me with that knife, I did the only thing I could think to do in that moment. I clumsily kicked some snow at her. There was enough of it to throw her off guard for a moment, I suppose, but it didn't really do me any good. The male clown just gripped my arm even harder, and the girl clown quickly gained her composure back. She walked up to me again, brandishing the knife and holding it up. Once she was close enough, I could see her eyes. The female clown put the knife up against my face and pressed the tip into it. I yelped as it pierced my skin. She dragged the knife down, making a shallow cut on my cheek, and whispered in my ear. Stevenson, 302. My dorm number. The clown behind me threw me onto the ground. I was worried about my face, sure, but I was happy he was about to let me go. As I was trying to stumble to my feet, I noticed them hurrying away. It didn't take long until both clowns were lost to the snow. Should I have felt relieved? Yeah, I really thought they were going to kill me. Did I feel relieved, though? No. They knew who I was, and they knew which room mine was, too. They were obviously willing to hurt me as well. Worst thing was, I had no idea who these people could be, what they looked like, or when I would see them again. Fortunately, housing let me change apartments immediately. I was pissed I had to leave the honors dorm, but a room had opened up next door to the science building at least. I never found out who those clowns were, and I have no idea if I ever saw them again without their disguises. They could have been anyone. They could have even had a class with me, and I would have never even known. My brother was a real jerk. Growing up, I liked animals quite a lot, and a lot of times just to spite me, he would always be an ass to them. I once had a cat. He would take it and throw it into the laundry dryer, then turn it on for a minute. He would open the door and the cat would bolt out in a panic. He would also put it into a bucket, hold it in there, and hang the bucket from a tree branch. He would then pull the branch down and launch the cat into the air like a catapult. The cat would do several somersaults before luckily landing on its feet and running away. He would do all kinds of dreadful things, then laugh at me when I cried and tried to get him to stop. The worst thing my brother ever did to an animal, though, happened late one summer night. Our parents were out of town, and he happened to be watching me. Our other brother, as much of a jerk as he was, did let us stay up late at least. That was pretty nice. We had a nice house in the country, and it was nice to stay up late in the summer. On the first night my parents were away, around midnight we heard this barking and growling out in our front yard. Obviously, some dog was out there. I looked out the window and saw a ragged husky standing just off our front porch. The poor thing looked like it had been through hell. It was dirty, had patches of hair missing in places, and may have even been sick. We ignored it for the most part, because dogs in the yard were not an unusual thing. Eventually, it left all on its own. The following night, we heard the dog barking again. I looked out the window only to see it was the same old husky. It was odd that the dog had come back around the same time, but we didn't really give it too much mind. Again, dogs in the yard were not an unusual thing. After a while, it left once more. We heard the dog barking again around midnight the following night. As I had done the previous nights before, I checked out the window and saw it was the same husky. I told my brother I was a bit scared this dog kept on coming back. Well, as you might imagine, telling him that was a mistake. Letting my brother know you're scared is never a smart thing to do. He began to make fun of me, teasing me that the dog was going to get into the house and eat me. Occasionally, he would go to open the door and taunt like he was going to let the dog into the house. My other brother and I would cringe and scream for him to close it right now. He would, but our fear just made him tease us even more. At one point that night, my brother grabbed my cat and tormented me by grabbing it and threatening to throw it out the door so the dog could kill it. While I was crying and begging him to stop, he opened the door just a bit. He was shocked to see the husky was right there. It began to bark and growl at him and startled him greatly. The cat freaked out and clawed the hell out of my brother's hand. It got loose and immediately ran in the opposite direction. My brother was pissed off now, but he couldn't take it out on the cat. Instead, he decided to take it out on the dog. Fair warning, there's some animal cruelty here and it's quite graphic. The most traumatizing thing I've ever experienced in my life happened next. My brother ran into our parents' room and grabbed my dad's shotgun. We begged him not to, but his hand was bleeding from being clawed at, and he was angry. He took the gun and sprinted outside, slamming the door in our faces. Then, right in front of our eyes, as we looked out the window, we saw our brother shoot and kill that husky. All we could do was scream and cry. My brother came back in and dragged us out into the dark with him. He made us grab shovels and made us go and bury that dead husky. It was terrible. The shotgun blast had torn the poor thing to shreds. It was traumatizing to see an animal looking like that. It was past midnight now, and hot outside. We lived way out in the country. We were both in shock from what we'd just seen, and here we were digging a grave for a poor animal who hadn't done anything wrong other than come to our yard. It took 2 hours, but finally we got it buried rather deep. The next day was absolute hell. My other brother and I tried to brush off the entire incident as if it were nothing. I had never known anyone who could care so little for the life of an innocent creature as my brother did. After that dreadful day, we were trying to watch some movies later at night to get our minds after what happened. As midnight approached, I heard the scariest thing I'd ever heard in my life. I heard the exact same bark as we'd put up with the past 3 nights in our front yard. My older brother looked really shocked, but it was nothing compared to how he looked when he got up and glanced out the living room window. He turned completely white and his jaw fell open. I moved up to get a look out the window with him, but he told me to sit back down. He closed the drapes and ran over to the front door and locked it. He came back over to the couch and sat down with the 2 of us. He kept on looking at that window until the barking eventually stopped. That was the last night we ever heard the barking. My brother went and dug up the grave of the husky after, but never told us whether the dog was still buried or not. I'm not 100% sure what really happened that night, but I will tell you one thing. My brother was never cruel to an animal after. When I was 12 years old, my dad got a really good new job, and we found a new house in a really nice area of town. It was the first time we'd ever moved, so it was a bit of an adjustment for me, even though it was in the same town. I didn't even have to change schools. One thing that helped was that I really liked the house. It was a brick building that had 3 floors and an attic. It was also enormous and obviously very old. The doors to all the rooms were wooden and had actual keyholes as well. I had never actually seen a door with a natural keyhole, except in cartoons. The floors were old hardwood that creaked when they were walked upon. It was like nothing I'd experienced before. It didn't take long for me to want to explore the entire house. It had a lot of extra rooms, and my mom had plans on using them for various things. A study, a sewing room. She even had a library, which was really cool because I loved books. A few months after we'd settled into the house, while we were eating dinner one night, my older brother said something really interesting. He told my mom there was an old woman up in the attic. "Stop trying to scare your little brother," my mom told him. He insisted he wasn't trying to scare anyone, though. My mom really didn't believe him because he was always trying to pull scary pranks on me. When my brother continued to insist, my dad put his foot down and told him to stop. My brother would never defy my father, so he did stop. I could tell he was very displeased, though. The following day, my brother got home from school the same time I did. Both of our parents were at work, so we were at home all alone. When I was in my bedroom changing out of my school clothes, my brother came to talk to me. He told me he hadn't been trying to scare me the previous night. He was really telling the truth. I assured him I believed him, even though I really didn't. He asked me if I wanted to go up into the attic with him and see the old woman then. I declined, telling him I had a lot of homework to do. He proceeded to tease me as big brothers tend to do, calling me a chicken and such. Eventually, I did give in, and he and I went on our way. The entrance up to the attic was on the 3rd floor of the house. It was this steep staircase that led up to an old door. I had been there a few times as we'd moved in, and really never had a problem with it. I did understand, though, how it could seem scary. I just always thought it was cool as the rest of the house was, though. Being with my brother and knowing he was going to try and scare me when we got to the door, it did look a little bit foreboding now. My brother was walking in front of me, so I thought for a moment that he must have been sincere and not trying to scare me. If he was trying to frighten me, surely it would make more sense to just walk behind me and grab me at an opportune moment. He opened up the door, and the two of us walked into the attic together, with him going first again. The attic itself was a bit ominous. It was a large area that didn't have any drywall up, just a lot of bare insulation. It was huge and full of all sorts of things my parents had put up there, and some others from before as well. My brother pointed to a Christmas tree sitting in the corner of the room. Must have been left over from the previous owners, I assumed. He was pointing towards the tree because that's where he had seen this old woman. Despite the fact I was expecting him to scare me, something like a jump scare, I leaned forward and squinted to get a closer look. While I was looking, I heard the attic door slam shut behind me. Angry I'd fallen for the trick, I turned around, only to see my brother standing far away from the door, real fear in his eyes. He was looking over in that direction, so I turned around and looked too. Standing behind the tree, looking at us through the branches, was what looked like an old woman, peering at me. I began to back away towards the door, even though I knew this was not going to do me any good. As I did, I saw the woman reach forward and with her scrawny, bony hands, move the branches to the side. She reached out with the other and beckoned me to come closer. She opened her mouth, and I could see maggots wriggling around on her gums. She made this awful moaning noise. I'm not proud to tell you I screamed like Jamie Lee Curtis and ran to the door. Although it had slammed shut, I was happy to know that the horror movie cliché of a slammed door becoming inexplicably locked did not apply here. I opened that damn door and grabbed my brother to sprint out of that attic. I told my parents what happened later, but they never believed me. They thought it was my brother's taunting that had influenced my imagination. As far as I'm aware, neither of them experienced it. I've had to go back into the attic at later points in my life, but I never saw that woman again. I'll never forget that image though, and neither will my brother. This isn't a particularly long story, but it is easily the scariest thing that's ever happened to me in my entire life. When I was a younger child, I was deathly afraid of the typical things. Monsters in my closet or something hiding underneath my bed. I would always have to check both of them before going to sleep, so much so that it became a daily routine. I would go over, open the closet door, have a good look around, and then close and latch it. Afterwards, I would go over, kneel down in front of my bed, and peer underneath. After I confirmed that there was nothing there, I would turn off the light and hurry over to my bed, which was placed up against the wall. I would keep myself against the wall until I fell asleep. Of course, I always felt silly in the morning, and promised myself I would not do it again the next night. Regardless, when the next night rolled around, there again I would be. I was about 11 years old when, for the first time, I had a friend over to spend the night. My parents had this weird rule that we couldn't have friends stay overnight until we reached the age of 11. I don't really know why that specific age, but anyway, my friend Kevin and I watched some scary movies after my parents went to bed. When we were done, he went to my room. He put a big sleeping bag on the floor right next to my bed. It was a sleepover, so we weren't really planning on going to sleep just then. He laid down and started chatting, as I was laying on my bed and he in his bag. Suddenly, he got up, went over, and turned out the light. I actually felt a bit of a jolt go through me, because I hadn't expected him to do that. As Kevin got back into his bag and we continued to chat, I found that doing so had become somewhat strained. For the first time since I could remember, I was in my room in the dark, without having checked either the closet or under the bed for intruders. Of course, the fact that we had watched scary movies really didn't help either. While we lay there in the dark talking, Kevin seemed to realize I was really tense. He made some bad gay joke that I was scared he was going to make a move on me, and we both laughed a bit together. I tried to relax for a while and keep chatting, but it wasn't long before Kevin had drifted off and stopped responding. Laying there awake and somewhat alone now was a bit frightening to me. I tried to just close my eyes and go to sleep, but it was too difficult. I knew I had to do my routine or I would not be getting any sleep that night. Of course, I couldn't turn the light on without Kevin waking up. I had a little book light on my nightstand though, so I grabbed it and moved out. I listened to Kevin's snores as I hopped off the bed very lightly. I crept over to the closet, making as little noise as I could. I turned the doorknob very slowly until I heard it click open. Opening it a bit, I shone the book light into it and confirmed it was indeed empty. I closed the door and made my way back over to the bed. I crawled up onto it because I figured I could just lean over and peer underneath. I took the light and slowly looked over the side, only to find myself looking into the eyes of a little boy hiding under my bed. I jumped in fright and dropped the book light on the floor. Kevin, of course, came out from underneath, laughing his ass off at me. Heaving from under the bed, he told me he was sorry, but he just couldn't resist when he'd woken up and saw me checking out the closet. He just had to try and scare me. I appreciated that. I mean, that's what male friends do to each other. Still, I asked him to turn the light on for me so I could calm down a little bit. He got up, went over to the light and flipped it on. When Kevin looked back at me though, he turned as white as a sheet. I followed his gaze toward the foot of my bed to see what had scared him. There was a little girl our age standing at the foot of the bed in a nightgown. I couldn't see her face for some reason. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'd like to play." The lights went out, and then when they came back on, she was just gone. Kevin stood there for a moment before asking if he could sleep in the same bed tonight. Yes was my only reasonable response. I'd woken up in the middle of the night, but I wasn't quite sure why yet. Not only did I work 12-hour shifts during the day, which obviously weared me out, but I was one of those really deep sleepers, even when my alarm clock would wake me up. It took me a little while to realize that it was indeed my alarm clock going off. Even then, I had a really hard time shaking the grogginess. After a few moments, I realized my daughter was standing on the side of my bed, trying to wake me up apparently. I fumbled around for my glasses, but I couldn't find where they were. Couldn't remember where I'd left them either. She was tugging on my sleeve, so I gave up finding them immediately. My wife was out of town, so I had the whole bed to myself. Somehow, I rolled all the way over onto the other side. I was so exhausted, I didn't want to do anything. I just gave up and asked my daughter what was wrong. "There's a ghost in my room," she told me, fear evident in her voice. If my wife had been home, she would have let her climb into bed with us. I, however, really didn't like that kids have to get over being scared of the dark. That was not going to happen if parents continued to baby them and indulge their fantasies about ghosts and monsters. "Sweetie, there's no such thing as ghosts," I told her. "You need to go back to bed. Daddy has to work in the morning and you can't go to school all tired either." "But there's a ghost in my room, I swear there is." I groaned. I didn't believe this sort of nonsense, and I wasn't happy my daughter was obviously believing it either. I rolled over and managed to pull myself up to a seated position. "Sweetheart, it's not true. Whatever's in your room is just your imagination. Now, go back to bed." My daughter stopped for a moment and seemed to think about what I'd just said to her. "Okay, Dad, could you at least check my room for me to make sure?" I supposed it would be the best way for me to get back to sleep. "If I check your room out, will you go back to bed?" "I promise," she told me. I hopped up out of bed and went out of my room and into the hallway. I felt like I was almost drunk as I stumbled around. I was so exhausted I could barely even walk straight. The only thing I knew was that when I got back to bed, I might never wake up again with how tired I was. When we got to the room, my daughter jumped into bed and got under the blankets. "Check in the closet, please." Slowly, I made my way over. Grabbing the door, I rolled it open and looked inside. Of course, there was nothing there. I let her know this. She seemed very pleased. Okay, check under the bed too. Will you go to bed right after I do? I asked her. She promised, so I staggered over, grabbed the side of the bed to steady myself, and when I had the leverage I needed, I lowered myself down and peeked under the bed. Much like I had expected, there was nothing there. I was about to straighten myself back up when the grogginess started to clear up a little bit, and suddenly I realized something. My daughter had gone with my wife to visit her parents, and I was supposed to be in the house alone. I felt like my heart stopped as I thought back to that character now on the bed. I quickly jumped up to my feet, only to see that no one was there anymore. Nervous now and just a little bit scared, I jumped away. I half expected someone to reach out and grab my leg or something. Shakily, I made my way back to my bedroom. I turned all the lights on, because I'll admit, I was pretty scared. I repeated the same routine I'd done in my daughter's room. Checked under my bed, in the closet. I checked everywhere else as well. Nothing to be found. I slept with the light on that night. When my wife got home, I told her what had happened, and she got a pretty good chuckle out of making fun of me. Now, whenever my daughter comes to my room claiming she's seen a ghost or a monster, I just let her crawl into bed with me. When I was 19, I got an apartment with a friend of mine from high school. We didn't have that much money, so we didn't have much to put in the apartment either. My parents weren't exactly made of money, and so couldn't really help when I moved out. That was fine though. I didn't expect them or even really want them to help me. The one big mistake I made though, is I should have waited until I could buy a car before I moved out. This happened in northern Illinois, back when Blockbuster Video was still a thing. I bring that up because I worked at a Blockbuster that was a few miles away from the apartment building. Although I could almost always take the bus to get to work, the buses in the area never ran late, so if I happened to be working a night shift, I would have to walk home alone. It wasn't really that bad though. I didn't mind the walk or the cold. The only thing that ever really bothered me was when it rained or snowed. I hated being wet, and even if you have an umbrella, you can't really be walking out in the rain or snow without getting somewhat wet at least. It was mid-December, and I was working a really late shift at the store. We didn't close until 11 p.m. We were expecting a ton of snow that night, so our business was particularly dead. The manager of the store actually asked me if I wouldn't mind closing up on my own. He had to go pick up his kids from school, and he wanted to get them home before the snow really started. I didn't mind. In fact, I relished the idea of being alone at work. We weren't going to get any customers that night anyway, so I'd basically have the entire place to myself to watch any movies I wanted to. The snow started falling not long after they left. It was about 5 p.m. I watched the snow falling in the light of the street lamps outside. Big flakes today. The snow was sticking and began piling up pretty quickly. Despite enjoying the fact I was alone in the store, I was beginning to dread the eventual walk home. Sometimes I could convince someone to give me a ride, but in these weather conditions there was no one around to ask in the first place. When the snow first began falling, there was a small increase in business. Customers were likely aware they were going to be stuck in the home all evening, wanted some movies to watch. As soon as 6:30 though, it was completely dead inside, and the roads and lot were completely empty as well. I was watching a movie on the display televisions when I heard the buzzer that someone had just come in through the door. They were a somewhat tall and ragged-looking man. Looked a lot like a stereotypical Vietnam vet drifter you might see in an old movie actually. Unshaven, wearing a green jacket with patches, long wild hair being held by a do-rag, and very crazy eyes. He was soaked from coming in from the snow. He tracked in glob drops of snow all over the carpeting, annoying the hell out of me. It became obvious before too long that this man was not going to be renting any movies. He was just trying to come in from the cold. He was moving aisle to aisle, not particularly looking at anything. just trying to make himself seem busy. Every now and again, he'd shoot me a dirty look when he knew I was watching him. It unnerved me a little bit, because I had to watch him. I was the only employee in the store, and it was my job to keep an eye on suspicious people. This guy was really suspicious. When the guy had been in the store for 30 minutes without picking up a single video, as well as going down the same aisles over and over, I finally worked up the nerve to approach him. I was already upset he had tracked in so much snow all over the place. I didn't even get the chance to offer any help though, because right as soon as I walked up to him, before I even got a word out, the man got aggressive. "Oh, you want me to leave your store, huh? I'm not the kind of guy you want in here scaring your other customers away, is that it?" Before I had the chance to answer and tell him I was just offering to help and there was no one else here anyway, the man began to angrily storm through the store. He started knocking over several shelves of videos in a rage, stammering on about things like, "All of you people better fuck off. I just want to watch a movie like everyone else," and mindless random ranting. I couldn't do much. All I could do was watch the man slam the door and disappear into the snow. Took me the rest of the night to clean up after that guy. I had to clean off the video cases he knocked to the floor. They were fallen into the wet snow he'd tracked in. I also had to restock them to the right places. Then I had to go grab a special machine to soak up all the water too. About a half hour before we closed, I'd finally finished cleaning up the mess he'd made. I hadn't gotten a single customer in that time period, but I was not particularly surprised. The snow had been falling heavy and steadily and was really piling up now. I walked up to the front door to get a good look out at how high the snow had been piling up. There was at least 2 feet out there by now. I knew it was going to be hard to get home now. I didn't see any cars on the road. At the very least, I had the next day off, so I could fix some hot chocolate and enjoy the weather. Suddenly, a figure standing in the falling snow caught my attention. This Blockbuster was in a rather large shopping area. He was standing in the Target parking lot. It shouldn't have bothered me, really, but I thought I could see him looking into my store. My mind immediately considered it may have been the drifter from earlier, but that just seemed ridiculous, right? The man had left nearly 2 hours ago. Surely he could not have just been hanging out in the snow waiting for me. He'd have to be insane to try in such weather conditions, as long as he would have had to have been there. I went back to the counter for a few moments, but I just couldn't shake it from my mind. After a few more, I walked back to the door. The man was still standing there, exactly in the same place, and now I could tell he really was looking into my store. I looked at my watch and saw there was only 15 minutes left before I was supposed to close. It seemed most of the other stores in the area had already closed early. I decided it would be a good idea to do so myself. Looking at the guy standing out in the storm, I pulled the door tight and locked it. I couldn't take my drawer out because it wasn't closing time, but I switched the sign to closed, then went to the back room to get a drink. When it hit 11 o'clock, I went back up to get my drawer so I could close it all down. Immediately, when I got to the lobby, I froze. The man from earlier was standing at the front door of the store. As soon as he saw me, he began to pound at the window furiously. "Let me in. I want to rent a video," he yelled at me. He was covered in snow. It was as if he had been standing there for the entire past 2.5 hours and hadn't knocked any snow off of himself. Steeling myself, I called out, "I'm sorry, sir, but we're closed." At that moment, the man went into a complete rage. He grabbed the door handle and began to shake it as much as possible. He was screaming at me, telling me he had been in there before they'd closed, and I needed to let him back in right now so he could rent a video. He kept on pounding on the glass. I can't even describe the fear I felt. I warned him to stop or I'd call the police, but that only made things worse. The man's eyes grew wide and crazed. He began to throw his body against the door, screaming that he was in here before, over and over like a machine. Terrified, I ran for the phone and dialed 911. I told the operator what was going on. The guy was loud enough that it could be heard through the phone itself. She told me they would dispatch a car, but due to the weather, it would take quite a while for them to get there. She advised me to keep an eye on the guy and find something to protect myself with. When I got off the phone, the lunatic was still full throwing his body up against the door. I was terrified, but in a shaky but loud voice, I told him I'd just called the cops. The man stopped in place. A grin slowly formed across his face. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a hunting knife. You know the kind I mean, with the slightly curved blade and the slightly serrated backside. He tapped it against the window. Grabbing the blade with his other hand, he slowly and completely sliced open the palm of his hand, then took his palm and started smearing blood all over the door. Putting the knife back in his jacket, he looked over to me. "I was in here before. I'll be waiting for you on your walk home." He walked off into the snow and disappeared. The police arrived and took a report. I was there for a long time, and they had to call my manager as well. The police had to take the security cameras. It was nearly 1 a.m. by the time I finally got to leave. At least when I did, the police were nice enough to give me a ride home. I use Tinder pretty frequently. It's usually pretty cool. Just meeting people, chilling, smoking with most of them really. I matched with this one dude named Charlie, and at first he seemed pretty cool. He was really cute and played music as well, which was really appealing to me. I sing and play the piano too. We talked for a little while, and I agreed to meet him at his house. Mistake number 1. Why the fuck did I think it was a good idea to meet a stranger in their own home? I didn't even drive. I took an Uber over. It was a decent ways away, so it was kind of pricey as well. When he buzzed me into the apartment complex, immediately I got this really creepy vibe. I shook it off though. It must have just been nerves. I went up to the 3rd floor and saw him standing at the door. Things were mostly cool at first. We were chilling, smoked a couple of bowls, we were watching a movie together. He made a move on me and I went with it. We went onto the bed and were obviously engaging in some adult activities when out of nowhere, he wrapped his hands around my neck hard. Now, that's all fine and good with me. I can dig that in the right setting. But alone in a stranger's house, when he didn't even check to see if it was okay? That was not one of those settings. He was choking me so hard I literally couldn't breathe. I was fairly certain I was even turning blue at this point. I felt like I was about to pass out. He was just relentless. Not only was he asphyxiating me, he got right in my face and started asking me if I was scared. He had this wild look in his eyes, and I could tell he was trying to kill me right now. As I started to struggle against his grip, he gripped it even tighter around my neck. I'm not even kidding you. I thought I was going to die. By some miracle, I managed to wriggle a bit out of his grasp and get enough breath to start screaming. He was yelling at me to calm down now, and I was frantically trying to grab my clothes. He grabbed my wrist as I was trying to leave. I had to use all of my strength to pull away and slam the door quickly behind me. As it was closing, I could hear him bid me adieu with the charming words, "You fucking cunt." I got home and looked in the mirror, only to see I had giant handprint bruises all around my neck. I tried to cover it up with makeup, to no avail. It looked like I was just almost strangled to death. He texted me saying, "I think you need more than one dick." Oh really? You want to bring a friend and kill me together next time? How lovely. I blocked him and reported him on Tinder, of course. I wish I could have done more, because I seriously think he really wanted to end my life. I've been debating on going to the police, but the bruises are gone now. It's a he said, she said thing, unfortunately. I'm really thinking I will, though, because the next girl might not be so lucky. 0 out of 10 would not try an attempted murder ever again. This just happened to me today, and I'm still pretty freaked out by it. I'd had my first driving lesson today, so I was pretty worn out afterward. I was also feeling unwell at the same time, a bit nauseous with a sore throat and a heavy cough. After the driving lesson, I came straight home, laid down on the couch under a cozy blanket, and began practicing some driving theory from apps I'd downloaded. I was at home alone. This meant there were no cars in the driveway or out in front of my house. I had the lights on low as well, as my front room received a lot of light from the large front window anyway. I'd been sitting there for almost 2 hours, dazed out of my mind, barely even moving, when I heard an aggressive knock on the front door. The postman had already come by, and we weren't waiting on any packages to be delivered or anything like that. I also hadn't heard a car pull up either. It must have been someone selling something, I thought to myself. Recently, our village had been somewhat bombarded with charity workers, who once they finished their spiel, would tell you they couldn't accept cash donations. Instead, you had to sign up for a direct debit and pay at least £12 a month. Being unwell, tired, and too embarrassed to reject yet another charity worker, I stayed put and just hoped they would leave on their own. They knocked twice more, increasingly louder than the time before. Eventually, I did hear them walk away down the front steps. I crept over to the front window to peer through and see who it was and where they'd go. Except when I looked out, I couldn't see anybody there. I'd read enough creepy stories and seen enough scary movies that multiple scenarios niggled at my mind, but as most people would do, I assumed nothing of it and decided to make myself lunch instead. I headed through the kitchen, which I should mention faced the backyard. Immediately, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. My vision slid over to the window, where I saw what looked to be the top of someone's head peeking out from underneath, as if they were trying to crouch down as they passed by. I froze, but let my eyes follow, until I saw a person appear at the patio door, clearly getting ready to attempt to enter. We made eye contact. A tall man, big build, wearing what looked to be a tracksuit with a black jacket on top. As soon as he realized I had seen him, he bolted immediately. I heard him run up the side of my house, so I ran to the front room again, where I saw him continue to sprint down the street and disappear out of sight. Being the big, brave girl I am, I phoned my dad right away and cried and begged for him to return home, which he did. My hero. Okay, so this happened to me when I was around 18 or 19 and just started college in a small town in the South. I had a pretty terrible college experience in general, but this just added to the shit show that was my first year. To set the scene, I lived in a sweet building with a parking garage attached to it. There were probably 4 or 5 levels to this garage, and the top level was at ground level. The suite building was about a 5-minute walk down a sidewalk to the entrance. There was also a little room with windows that housed the elevator nearby the sidewalk. My boyfriend at the time lived off campus, and I hated being on campus so much that I spent a lot of time at his house in a neighboring town. I did have an 8 a.m. class though, so I would usually at least go back to my suite at some point in the night or early morning if I could. One night, I'd just gotten back at around 2 a.m. The parking garage was pretty full on this night, and I had to park at the furthest end of the building, closer to the ramp that went to the lower levels. I'm terrified of being inside parking garages for long times, so usually I'd always park at the top. It was pretty dark out. I would also usually call my sister or my boyfriend if I was spooked. This night was pretty normal though, so I didn't really feel the need to bother them yet. I was almost to the sidewalk when I noticed someone in the little room where the elevator was. They had been hidden behind a wall, but after I passed them by, I saw them emerge. It seemed he'd come out as soon as he thought I wouldn't notice him, since I wasn't able to see him through the windows there. I didn't get a great look at him, but I could tell it was a middle-aged man. I found it quite odd such a person would be on campus so late at night, and in the building where there were mostly only young people and freshmen as well. I tried my best to just ignore this person and continue on my way. As I reached the nearby sidewalk though, about 20 feet away, I could see he was more brazenly following me now, walking right behind me. I tried my best to be rational and not freak out. The further I walked though, the more I realized he was now gaining on me. There was one of those posts nearby where you could hit a button for campus police, but something inside of me told me that I had to not let him know I knew he was there, and that he was also scaring me. In a few seconds' time, I had to make a decision. I started to sprint down the sidewalk. Right from behind me, I could hear him pick up speed and start running on the pavement as well. He was chasing me. There were 3 entrances to this building. Usually I used the furthest one because my room was on the far side of the building. As soon as I got to this first entrance though, I swiped my card as fast as possible, threw open the door, and slammed it shut behind me. The man was right there, right on the other side of that door. He made eye contact with me for a while, then turned and sprinted the other way and out of view. I was so fucking scared that night, and still to this day. I wonder what his intentions really were. Probably for the best I never had to find out. The very next morning, I woke up to an emergency email about a strange man that had been spotted on campus the previous night. Still gives me creeps whenever I think about it. I'm a fairly small 18-year-old girl, and this happened on a Saturday night literally just last week. My friend Leia and I attended a football game, but somewhere through the night we got pretty bored. We decided to head to a haunted house with our friends Tara, Dawson, and Emma instead. It was a haunted corn maze, and we had a blast honestly. Eventually though, the night started to wind down, and me, Leia, and Terry decided to go back to Terry's dorm room, so the hangout could continue for a bit longer. We had dyed Leia's hair and were currently watching a movie when we heard 3 loud slams echo on the door suddenly. Terry's roommate went to go and check who it was. We heard someone grunt, then saw a man whom none of us recognized shove their way past the door and into the bathroom. We were all completely confused. We poked our heads out the door, only to see Terry's roommate laid out on the floor. The man had pushed him to the ground, just to enter the common area of the room. All of us agreed we had no idea who this person was. We started laughing together and making jokes about the situation, because that's just how we coped with it at the time. Terry's roommate went to go tell the front desk that someone had come into our room and started taking a shower. Again, it was a Saturday night, so we assumed this man must just be drunk or something, and perhaps had the wrong room. Eventually though, we started to hear rustling in the bathroom, and loud scratches and bangs coming from the door. We started to get a bit scared at this point, so we locked ourselves in Terry's room together. Eventually we heard the bathroom door burst open, and we all turned toward the locked door to this room. We jumped, as the man began to slam on the door with his fists. He was breathing so deeply and heavily, we could hear it from the other side of this thick door. Leia and I screamed as the banging got louder and louder. He began to throw his entire body weight against the door. Terry was in the back corner of the room as they were starting to spiral into a panic attack. We had no clue what was going on. At first, we thought it must just be a drunk guy, but no guy who's hammered out of his mind has enough coordination to take a running start into a door. Finally, the banging stopped. We thought the man must have left for a moment, but we didn't dare leave the room to check. It was silent for a whole 3 minutes before a weird scratching noise started on the door. It sounded like the man was scraping his fingernails against it, like a dog trying to be let into a house. "Let me in," he whispered. "Please, let me in, please! I know you're in there! Let me in, damn it!" He began to yell and slam against the door again. How was no one else in this dorm floor hallway coming to help us? Fear was crawling up my body. I didn't know what to do. I have a stress disorder I take medication for, and this was not the ideal situation for me to be in. I slid down the floor and wall, and sat on the floor with my head in my hands to try and calm myself. It had been 10 minutes since Terry's roommate went to get campus security. We finally called the front desk of the dorm as well. Apparently, they had already called security the moment my roommate had gotten down there, so why was it taking them this long to get here and help? The man continued to try and break down the door for another 10 minutes. Just as we really thought he was going to break through, and the hinges were starting to shake. About 25 minutes after we'd initially asked for help, campus security finally arrived. They sat the man down and started to have a conversation with him instead of taking him out of the dorm room. At this point, I was pissed. What if we hadn't been in a place where we could lock the door? What if we were outside or something? Would they still have taken 25 fucking minutes to show up? The man told them he hadn't been drinking or smoking or doing anything, that he was completely fine. They continued to question him, only to have him get more and more violent. Finally, they had to escort the man out when he began to fight with one of the cops. We could hear everything through the door. The campus security finally knocked, telling us it was safe to come out now. When we opened the door, something fell off and hit the floor. The cop's eyes widened as he realized what it was. It was a fucking pocket knife that had been lodged into the door. Not only did these idiots take 25 minutes to show up, they didn't even check the man or the surrounding area to see if there was a weapon. What a joke. Leia started to cry as we left the room. The security decided to check the rest of the dorm room. Lo and behold, they found a crumpled up ball of tinfoil with what looked to be drugs in it. What a great investigative job. The dude was methed out of his mind or something with a pocket knife, and all they could say was have a safe night before leaving on their way. Safe night my ass. We were all complaining to the campus next week about how the situation was handled, mainly because I know this man is still there. I saw him walking down the road just yesterday, like nothing had ever happened. Man, fuck campus security, and fuck that methed out man. This story happened 26 years ago in the San Francisco Bay Area, actually closer to Half Moon Bay. 95 or 96, I'm not too sure exactly. It was late on a Friday night. I was living in the Bay Area and going to graduate school soon. It had also been a very busy week. My roommates all decided to go out clubbing to celebrate, but I decided I was just going to stay home and relax and wind down a bit. It was probably around 10 or 11 at night. Too late to really do anything I found fun. I got a wild hair and decided I would drive over to the ocean. I was living in Castro Valley, and I had been to Half Moon Bay a few times before, so I decided that would be a nice relaxing drive. About an hour and a half at night, but why not, you know? I'd go over and go for a walk on the beach at night for a little while and just chill in the ocean breeze. By the time I got there, it was getting pretty late, around 1 a.m. or so. What I hadn't realized is they actually locked up the parking lots at night so you could not go down to the beach in your car. Ah, dang. I started heading south on Highway 1 instead. I passed a few other pullouts, but they all had locked gates as well. Instead, I went up this hill where there was a dirt pullout. I thought I could at least hike back down the hill to reach the beach. It was only a couple 100 yards below after all. Obviously, I'm not one to get scared very easily, since I was out doing this all alone at night. This wasn't even the first time I'd done something like this, nor would it be the last either. After hiking down the hill about 30 feet or so, I stumbled into a patch of briars. I tried to keep going, but it was really tearing me up. It was really dark as well, so I couldn't really avoid them. I decided I'd just head back to the car and find a better spot to climb down. By the time I managed to make it back up to the top of this hill, though, I just about poked my head over, and I could see there was now another car parked right beside mine. Weird, I thought. My gut immediately told me something was off here, so instead of going to my car right away, I hunkered down behind the hill and just sort of watched. It was really, really dark out, overcast as well. There had been 0 cars on the road the entire time there, so my eyes were pretty well adjusted to the darkness. I was pretty close to the two cars. On a slight hill just over the pullout, I could see down into the other vehicle. They had some interior dash lights that were giving off a bit of a glow, so I could make out their face. Sitting in the vehicle was this middle-aged, normal-looking guy. He was absolutely staring at my car, though, like it was ice-cold water and he'd been lost in the desert for days. I don't really know how to explain it, other than as soon as I saw the look on his face, I could tell he was bad news. I laid down in the grass and shrubs to make sure he couldn't see me in the darkness, and I just watched him. I watched him sit there and watch my car waiting for me to come back. I decided it was not smart to go until he'd finally left. I waited and waited and waited. After about 15 or 20 minutes, I saw a glow on the crest of the hill on the highway. Another car was coming, the first I'd seen since I'd pulled over. Anyone that's driven down this road knows that if you're behind someone going slow, you're pretty much stuck behind them for a long while. This can lead to groups of cars being bunched up together. This is what started happening. Coming over the hill, it was just car after car as they crested over. Their taillights lit up the entire area with light. I quickly jumped up and sprinted to my car. I ripped the door open, and as I jumped in, I started it up in one motion. I could see the man's face. It was a look of anger like I've never seen since. I was able to pull out quickly and be the last car in that procession as we made our way back to Half Moon Bay. I left all the details on that I can remember. I still think about this event every now and again and wonder, but I've never been able to find any mentions of other suspicious goings-on there in this time frame. I thought I'd post it here for all of you to hear and see if anyone else ever heard anything about that area in time. Such a weird experience. I currently live in a smaller, rural-ish town. It's pretty far removed, but it still has plenty of good shopping and eating options and some public spaces as well. We even have a few breweries and bars now. It's a newly hip place, with farming on the outskirts so I can get my eggs and veggies fresh from the source as well. The pandemic really hurt business locally though, and pretty much the only regular delivery option was Walmart and Amazon for a minute. I was pretty stoked when much later, more local options popped up on various apps. However, at this time for main necessities and grocery items, there weren't really any options beside getting a store delivery from the Walmart in the town over. This meant a lot of people you didn't know well popping through, and it drove some of the older folks absolutely crazy. All over the neighborhood they were talking about cars and people they didn't recognize non-stop. I embraced it pretty readily though. It certainly made my life easier, so it was great for a bit. At this point, I lived with my teenage son, who was very gangly and about 6'4". Then my boyfriend was staying to be near his elderly parents as well. He was broadly built. It was a tiny space, and I felt a little bit cramped with these huge guys always trundling around. Once in a while, I'd send them off on an errand for me, or they'd go and visit my boyfriend's parents together to give me a little bit of space to work on things. One of those days, I happened to get a delivery. I recognized this guy and said hello to him. Tipped him well, too. Then I just went about my life. An hour later, though, he was right back at my door. It was kind of weird and creepy as well. I had steps in front of my door, but no porch. He would knock and stand beside the steps where I couldn't see him through the peephole. I could see him through my window that he was next to, though. I couldn't tell if he was hiding and didn't know I could see him or what. I talked through the window. Hello, can I help you? I had the window film over the lower window for privacy, but I could stand on my couch and see through the upper part above people's heads. He kept on trying to look at where my voice was coming from, before answering and telling me he'd forgotten a bag in the delivery. I confirmed I'd gotten it all though and thanked him. He left, and I didn't want to open the door again after he noticed I was alone. I got new neighbors after, directly in the unit across from me. They happened to have a Ring camera. She reached out to me at one point and told me someone had come by knocking and sat on my front steps for about a half an hour. I was over at my boyfriend's house with my son at the time. She sent me the Ring camera video to double check. It looked exactly like that guy, around 8 p.m. too, and I didn't have any open orders. I reached out to Walmart, but they were totally unhelpful, of course. They told me they'd be making sure he didn't deliver anything to me in the future, but wouldn't give me any info I could pass on to police in case anything further happened. I wanted to at least file a report with security in case anything happened again, because this felt like a really weird situation. They told me the police would need to reach out though. I had a feeling this would escalate further, and it really did. I didn't want to be home alone anymore. I didn't order delivery. I tried to cover my bases myself. However, that couldn't stop my neighbors from ordering as well. Somehow, it always came through that guy again. He would be on the property anyway, just 3 feet away from my door. Creepy thing was, I could hear him dropping off the neighbor's stuff, and I had an urge to look through the peephole, only to see him standing right in front of my stairs, staring at my door and trying to look in through my windows. He stood there for 5 minutes until my neighbor upended the door to get her groceries. I told her that was the same guy from the Ring camera. She contacted Walmart too and asked he didn't deliver anything anymore to our area. A few weeks went by and Christmas was just around the corner. I had ordered a few items from Amazon and they'd all be arriving together. I knew they were on my front porch. I could hear them being carried and dropped by the delivery guy. I went over to check and made sure to watch until he walked off. My boyfriend was on the couch with his headphones on working, and I was cooking dinner at the moment. I figured I'd just grab them in a minute. They'd surely be fine on my steps for just a moment. Plus, there was a camera there if anything happened. 5 minutes tops. I finished plating and brought the food in. As I was setting the plates down, the front doorknob, which wasn't locked at the moment, gave a tiny turn. The deadbolt was latched, but the knob wasn't. I could hear it turning but not opening. My boyfriend couldn't hear over his music though. I pointed it out to him. He took his headphones off and peeked over the top of the window. "Oh, were you hearing things maybe? No one's touching the doorknob right now and no one's out there either." He walked over and ripped the door open, just to show me there was nothing there. But there stood the man again, this time crouched up against the wall underneath the window, hands still on the knob trying to turn it silently. He looked mortified to see my boyfriend opening the door. When my son came up too, he looked really startled. He asked for me. He must have known my name from the deliveries because he used the name I had on my account, which isn't a name everyone knows me by. My boyfriend got angry and asked what he needed. The guy reached down and picked up the Amazon box, said delivery, handed it off, and then left. It was really unnerving. I tried to explain to my boyfriend that he had not delivered those boxes. They'd already been there. We took the footage to the police, and I tried to reach out to Walmart once again. The police told me they'd reached out too and just gotten a bunch of clueless basic customer service agents with no idea how to proceed. If he came back, I'd need to call the real police so they could come get him in person this time. I was really scared, of course. I was glad he knew I wasn't in the house alone now, but I felt like he might take more drastic measures, knowing that too. The sprinkler system automatically kicked in at 11 p.m. It cycled through the plot of land for about an hour. It started at my bedroom wall, which faced the parking lot. By midnight, it had gone around the entire space in tandem and reached the front lawn space to the right of my front door. I was in bed when I heard it click on. It was usually noisy because it hit the gravel too. It made a lot of sounds. When it switched off to the next area, I heard a strange shuffling. We have a lot of stray cats outside, so I wasn't too alarmed at first. There's one window at the side of my home that faces the front lawn spots, but it's blocked off by a large entertainment system. It was the only blocked window I had, and beside my bedroom window, it was the only one not visible from the Ring camera. The next morning, when I was leaving for work, the window screens had been removed and placed beneath the windows. There were handprints smudged all over the glass as well. No clear footprints, just deep, muddy sloshes where a person had clearly been. I filed another report, but they were similarly unhelpful. They basically told me I needed to get another camera and stay up to make sure I could see it happening, then call it in. Didn't even bother trying to contact Walmart again. Completely useless. The last thing to happen was when my boyfriend was coming over pretty late. He just worked a really long day and came over around 3 a.m. I knew he was supposed to be coming soon, but suddenly I was woken up by the sound of fierce fighting outside. He had pulled into the parking lot as promised, only to find the guy underneath my car. He'd scrambled under when my boyfriend's car was pulling in. He pretended to walk to the front door, only to watch the guy slide out and try to hide behind the parked cars. It looked like he was trying to mess with mine as well. He attacked the guy and I called the police. There was an air tag taped under my car. He was trying to track me away from my house. The man was arrested with plenty of charges, but I didn't really hear anything else from it after. I gave statements and incident report numbers, and I was told I might need to testify, but it never happened. I never had any incidents with him since then, though, so I'm grateful for that. This happened about a decade ago, and it still scares me. My great-aunt lived alone in a small 2-floor Cape house one town over. My grandfather had built it for her in the 1940s. She had a tiny spare bedroom and a writing office upstairs. My great-aunt was a nun and a teacher, and would often write friends, former students, and work on a book of her stories that she never quite managed to finish up there. My mother and I would visit from time to help take care of the chores in and around the house, as the years continued to go on. When I left for college, my mother started visiting more often. No sense in both of them being left alone, she told me. Whilst I was away, unfortunately, my great-aunt started showing signs of dementia that progressed quite steadily. It started with stories she'd tell us for the 1,000th time, even though we already knew them well. One would start when she and my grandfather were kids, then somehow resolve with her as an adult. Basically, she'd combine unrelated stories into one, leaving her extremely confused afterwards. She also started forgetting to eat, take her meds, and would crank up the heat in the summer to the point she'd be extremely dehydrated. Some days were worse than others, so when I finished college, we started visiting nearly daily. She absolutely refused going to an assisted living home. We set up meals on wheels and asked some of her friends and former neighbors to come by, so we wouldn't be the only ones taking care of her. My mother and I also convinced her to start writing in the kitchen rather than upstairs instead, to prevent her from having an accident on the stairs. Without a reason to go upstairs any longer, we shut off the old second-floor heaters and closed the over-painted squeaky door to the stairs. We'd find the door cracked open every so often, but my aunt insisted she didn't go up there anymore. We weren't the only ones stopping by though, so maybe someone had fetched something upstairs and forgotten to close it. Again, my great-aunt was a nun, so around the holidays she'd roll out the more religious stories and talk about God quite a lot. One day, when I happened to be visiting her alone, she started reflecting on her life, mortality, and when the man upstairs was going to come for her. I changed the subject as it was quite uncomfortable. But over time, she started talking more about when she'd die. He's going to come for me soon. I don't know when the man upstairs will do it, though. I tried to reassure her. Auntie, I'm sure you have many years left. God isn't going to come take you anytime soon. With the most serious expression I'd ever seen on her sweet old face, she said, "No, not God. The man upstairs." Around this point in time, she started seeing things. Flashes or spiders that weren't there, even a little boy in her living room that only she could see, even when my mom and I were visiting. Initially, I chalked this statement up to dementia. Later that week, snow fell, so after shoveling myself out early, I went to my great-aunt's to shovel her walkway for my mom, who'd be visiting later. After shoveling a bit, I called her from my warm car so she'd know it was taken care of. I also said I wasn't coming in, as I had to go to work. She thanked me, and I drove off. I noticed I'd forgotten my rock salt I had used on the walkway though, so I decided to circle the block and pick it up real quick. As I was reaching over for it, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. The second floor light in the old writing office had just turned on. I glanced over quickly, then pretended I hadn't seen it. I ran to my car and went down the road a short ways, confirming in my mirrors that it was still on, and I called my mom. "Hey Mom, can you call Auntie and see if she has anyone over? Don't say I asked, by the way. Let me know how long it takes her to pick up." My mom called back almost immediately. "No, she doesn't have company over, not this early. She picked up right away, why?" "You need to call the police right now. The light upstairs turned on after I talked to her. There's no way a 95-year-old lady hung up, hustled upstairs, and went back down to pick up your call right away." As my mom called the police, I called my aunt once again. "Hey Auntie, I almost forgot, you have a doctor's appointment today. I'll come pick you up, okay? We can grab a hot chocolate before we head on over." I parked my car in front of the house and acted as normally as I could. It felt like an eternity, helping her get her house coat on and out the door. As I turned the lock, I heard footsteps above us on the second floor room, where I'd seen the light turn on. I helped her into my car quickly, not once looking back at the house, too scared for what I'd see in the window. We shot down the road a bit, and I called my mom again. She was already on her way over, and said the police would be by shortly as well. I told her where I parked, and I waited. She arrived, and the police weren't far behind her. I flagged down the cop when he got closer, and told him what I'd seen and heard. He radioed for 2 more cars. My mom stayed with our great aunt to keep her calm, as the police now surrounded her house. I handed them the keys to the doors. 2 went in, as the 3rd cop and I stayed outside. A few tense moments passed, and the 2 officers returned with a disheveled, gaunt man, wrapped up in handcuffs. "Oh, that's the man upstairs," my aunt said to my mother, onlooking as they fought with this crazed man to get him into the back of one of the cruisers. Apparently, she had accidentally let a disturbed homeless man in, thinking he was the Meals on Wheels guy. He had been secretly living upstairs this entire time. My great aunt hadn't even known if he was real or not. When we were allowed back in, we saw that the upstairs was a complete mess. Garbage, rotting food stolen from the kitchen, and the amount of filth was scary. The creepiest things, though, were the notes, written many, maybe hundreds of times in different inks and pencil scrawlings around the writing office window that overlooked her walkway, was, "Go away. Don't stay. I'll come down." The back of the door to the stairs had notes too. "She can see me, but you can't. I can see you." It was clear he had probably written notes each time someone visited over the weeks and possibly months he had been staying there. My great aunt was temporarily shocked, but it was quickly forgotten given her condition. She would ask about the man upstairs less and less. The homeless man, who was in poor physical and mental health himself, was hospitalized and unfortunately passed after a few weeks later into the winter. Apparently he had escaped and died in the snow. Very unfortunate circumstances. My mom and I told my auntie a couple of weeks later when we found out. "Oh, I know. He told me last night. He's upstairs again, but you guys can't see him now." At that instant, my mom and I heard the door to the stairs squeak open, and we decided never to go up there again. So this happened to me about 4 years ago. At the time, I was 20 years old. It was during a tattoo convention in Toronto. I was still an apprentice artist back then, and this was my first time working at a convention. I was super excited, but also a bit underprepared. There were 6 of us going from the studio I worked in, 3 guys and us 3 girls. We booked separate hotel rooms. The guys booked theirs early, which was smart, whereas I booked the room for the girls very last minute. I didn't realize then that the rooms would all be booked up near the convention center. Needless to say, there were almost no affordable rooms left. I had a mini panic attack before I finally found a shitty Super 8 in Chinatown with a room left. I asked if any of the other gals minded, and they were totally fine with it, as we wouldn't be staying at the hotel much anyways. Fast forward to us arriving there. It was literally inside an Asian strip mall. It was extremely sketchy, but hey, what could we do now? We checked in, unpacked, and headed down to the convention center to set up our supplies. Afterwards, a bunch of other tattooers asked us all out for drinks. All 6 of us said sure, and we met up at a bar together. We had a pretty great night actually, and everyone was having a full-on blast. I was really not used to drinking at all though, and it was getting later and later. Being my first convention, I didn't want to be tired and hungover the next day, so I asked if anyone wanted to leave with me. They were all still partying though and didn't want to go. I didn't want to ruin their fun time, so I let them know I'd be heading back myself. I called up an Uber. When I got back, it was completely empty. I walked through the entire mall complex, and it was silent and dark. I made it to the hotel entrance and walked past the check-in desk. Dark there. It seemed no one was around anywhere. I was starting to get a bit creeped out and was kind of looking around nervously. I took the elevator to my floor and walked past the communal breakfast area. This is where scary shit started to happen. The breakfast room was pitch black, but I could see the silhouette of a man just sitting in there alone. When the man saw me, he stood up, and I could hear his footsteps creeping up behind me. I tried to stay calm. I told myself he was probably just heading to his own room. You're freaking out for no reason just because it's late. As I continued down those dark halls trying to find my room though, I decided for whatever reason to turn around. That led to the most disgusting sight I've ever seen. The doors for each room dipped into the wall slightly, you see. As I turned around, I shit you not, the man behind me dipped into one of the doorways out of sight, then peered at me from behind the wall. We made direct eye contact, and my heart fell into my stomach. I turned back around and started walking faster to get back to my room and lock the door. I was almost there now. I was at the T intersection of the hallway. There was a fire extinguisher behind glass in front of me. I could see the man following behind me in the reflection. I turned around again, only to see him dip behind some furniture and peek at me from behind it. At that point, I absolutely lost it. I started running and booked it the last few meters to my room around the corner. I swiped my keycard so fast, I'm surprised I didn't fumble and drop it. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it up tight. Thank God I turned a corner, because it seemed he hadn't seen which room was actually mine. I looked through the peephole in the door and watched him pace around the hall for a good 10 minutes before walking away. I immediately went to the hotel room phone to try and call security, but no one was answering. I called my coworkers, who were still at the bar, and told them what had happened too. They came right away and helped me find an employee. I guess they had next to no staff overnight, and no security whatsoever. The employee we did find tried to look for the guy, but of course he was long gone by now. He told me he'd checked the cameras, but I never heard if anything came from that. I don't know what would have happened if that guy had caught me, and I'm sure glad that I didn't have to find out. Every year, I like to take my family on vacation, so we can all have an enjoyable week of relaxation and bonding time together. We usually stay in hotels, but after having a third kid with my wife, we decided it would be best to stay in a house. Our 7-month-old son would often cry and throw tantrums most nights, and I figured that would be very inconvenient for the other guests. I'd never stayed in an Airbnb before, but I decided I would give it a shot, since my coworkers all spoke very highly of it. After getting used to navigating the site, I started to narrow down my search within a couple of cities that my wife and I thought would be nice to visit. I was excited when I found this beautiful house that went for a decently low nightly rate. It was just a short walk away from the ocean as well. In addition, there were shopping plazas where we'd be able to get our groceries for the week just a short drive away. I looked over the host's rating on the website, a middle-aged man named Tom. I was very happy to see he was consistently given a 5-star rating. I booked the house for 7 days, officially planning out our trip. After a super long car ride there, we finally pulled up to the home around 10:30 on the Friday we scheduled to check in. The house was pitch black and surrounded on all sides by woods, gave off a real eerie vibe. We followed the emailed instructions given to us from Tom to get into the home. We typed in the garage code and walked to the safe in the corner of the garage to enter the code to get the key. We got inside without too much trouble and began to unpack our things. The house was huge, having 6 bedrooms and 4 bathrooms, quite an upgrade to our own humble abode. My wife and I noticed the air smelled a bit musty inside, but we assumed that nobody else stayed here the week prior or something. We all brought our luggage up the stairs and picked out our rooms. Our 2 sons stayed in the same bedroom at the end of the hall, while my wife and I took the master bedroom, putting our baby in the room directly next to us. We were all quite exhausted from all this traveling, and probably went to bed around 11:30 or so. At some point during the night, though, I was awakened to hear my son talking to his mom next to our bed, saying that he'd heard a bunch of scary noises. My wife calmed him down and tucked him back in. This wasn't something uncommon. Our sons were both 5 years old and would often get spooked at night. I dozed off again pretty quickly. I was awoken once more by the sound of both of our sons running to our room crying this time. They both insisted they'd heard footsteps coming from above them. I decided I'd flip on the lights to get up and walk around with them to show them they were safe and nothing was there. After doing this, they relaxed a bit and I laid back down to go to bed. After I closed their door, though, I checked around once more, feeling a bit concerned now. I opened the door by their rooms that led to the attic and walked up the steps. I saw that the door at the top of the stairs was locked, which didn't surprise me. Within minutes of crawling back into bed, though, I heard screaming coming from my son's room. I sprinted out of bed and down the hallway and threw open the door to their room. I flipped on the lights. I could see both of my sons laying on their beds, hiding under their covers. I walked over to them and asked what was wrong. Their response was very unsettling to hear. One son told me he'd heard their door creak open and seen a shadow of someone staring in at him right outside. Something about the tone in his voice and the terrified look in his eyes told me he was not just making this up. Normally, I would just think this was one of their night terrors since we were staying in a foreign place, but with this being the 3rd time now, I couldn't help but believe what they were saying. By now, my wife was standing in the room with us. She'd heard everything. I asked her to take everyone into our room and stay there. I did have a concealed carry license and usually carried my gun with me, but this time I'd left it back at home not thinking I'd need it. Now I regretted not having it with me. I knew I'd have to search the house with nothing. As I crept downstairs to the main floor in the dark, I felt a bit scared. It was pitch black and completely silent. The sound of my breath and the light footsteps on the ground were the only sounds I could hear. They felt quite loud, despite my efforts to stay silent. I knew the light switch was somewhere at the bottom of the stairs. I fumbled around in the dark for a minute until I finally found it and flipped it on. My jaw dropped as I looked around and noticed that the front door to the house was wide open. I knew I had made sure the doors were all closed and locked before we went to bed. I slammed it shut, locked it again, and ran upstairs to inform my wife and kids as I locked the master bedroom door behind me. She dialed 911. They said they would have officers there soon. We were instructed to stay inside the room no matter what. Even though it was now 2:30 in the morning, I called the Airbnb owner to let him know there was some sort of break-in. I dialed his number and put it on speaker so my wife could hear him too if he picked up. What we heard next still haunts me to this day. All of a sudden, I could hear a faint ringing coming out from above us in the attic. It sounded immediately as I called him. My wife and I both looked at each other in total shock, knowing the house owner's phone was in the attic. The police arrived minutes after, and we explained everything that had happened. We booked a hotel that night, which was a short drive away from the Airbnb, and enjoyed the rest of our vacation. We eventually followed up with the police, wondering if they'd attained any further information. Turns out, Tom, the owner of the Airbnb, was in the attic that night walking around, which explains why our sons had heard those noises. He'd snuck down and opened the door to our son's room, but hid as my wife and I had gotten up after hearing our sons screaming. As we passed one of the rooms on the way down the hall, he crept down the stairs and ran away. Finally, we learned that the attic had several monitors hooked up to secret cameras around the house, so he was able to see and hear everything. It was quite a horrifying experience as a first-time Airbnb guest, and I plan to only rent hotels from now on. The following is a true story that happened in the early 1990s, when I was about 14 and lived with my parents. When I was 13 years old, my dad worked for a government contractor, and his work moved us from our hometown to another location about 200 miles away. To me, it seemed out in the middle of nowhere. We moved over my 9th grade year, but my dad moved first to find a place for us to live while our old house sold. We ended up staying in a rental for a short period of time, so my parents could find the right house to stay. After a few months went by, my parents finally found a place. Where we lived before, my hometown was a suburb and super expensive at the time. Where we moved to, the land and homes were a lot cheaper, so my parents took good advantage of that and bought a huge home. We went from a single-story, 3-bedroom, 1-bath house to a 5-bedroom, 3-bath, 2-story home. I didn't get to see the house before my parents put the offer, as they went home shopping while I was still at my new school. I remember when they drove by for the first time to show us the new house. It looked like a mansion compared to our other one. Although I did miss all my friends and my old neighborhood, this house looked so cool. It was in the oldest part of the city, as there was a lot of new construction going up all around. My parents had apparently got a really good deal on this home. Once we went inside, I knew why. It was evening when my parents got the keys to the new house, so by the time we met the realtor and drove over, it was dark outside, which made it all the more creepy. When we walked in, it was like a time capsule, like everything was frozen in the 1960s. It also had this musty old smell, like the place had been vacant and non-touched for years. Much later, I found out that in fact it had been sitting vacant for 8 years before we'd bought it. Even before that, it was odd the previous owners had never updated anything about the house. There was shag carpet everywhere, the appliances were all from the 60s, and the paint in the rooms was weird colors and peeling off. It looked like a crash pad for hippies or something. My dad was very handy, thankfully, so immediately they got to work renovating everything. My dad called in a lot of family help. Eventually, it was completely renovated, and we moved in. I had always felt uneasy in certain parts of the house. I could never explain it, but things like shadows appearing, lights turning on and off, even my sister's hairdryer turning on at 2 a.m. by itself one time. The thing that happened the most, though, was footsteps. I would hear them coming downstairs at night when everything was quiet. Fast forward to a year after we'd moved in. I was the first to notice something odd in the house. This started when I asked my parents to move to an upstairs room because it was bigger and had a walk-in closet. They agreed, of course. I started thinking about the layout of the house upstairs. You see, there was this big open room that was a majority of the upstairs space. We used it as a living room. At the end of the hallway that went to 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, the layout didn't make much sense. There was a void behind the other bathroom that was adjacent to mine. In fact, it was big enough room for another bedroom entirely, but that space went out over the garage. One day, I drew out our house like a diagram. I couldn't figure out why there would be such a big void there with nothing in it. I asked my dad, and he kinda shrugged it off. One day, I went outside to that side of the house to scope a bit further, and noticed something odd. It appeared there had once been a window there or something. It was covered up by some big vent-looking thing and a sloppy patch of stucco. At this point, I was super curious. I studied the layout once more and noticed the wall on the other side of the bathroom had a patch of drywall in the shape of a doorway. I must be right. There was another room here, but why had it been sealed off? Obviously, my dad would have killed me if I just broke open the drywall, so I had an idea. I wasn't sure if it would work. One day when my parents were away visiting my aunt and uncle, I opted to stay home. I knew they would be gone for hours because of the distance. I figured out that if I went up to the attic crawl space above the garage and broke through the drywall there, my dad might not notice that I'd done so. I doubted he'd ever go up there on his own. I grabbed some tools with me and began to cut through the drywall. Eventually, I made an opening big enough to crawl through between the studs. I was right. There was another room of our house hidden here. I was half excited and half terrified. I was excited I was right, but after looking around the room, it was obvious it had been a bedroom at one point in time. The walls were an old pink color, and the carpet had been completely pulled up. There was no padding, just the strips that tacked the carpet to the ground. I could see where they'd closed off the doorway. There were no doors to the closet in that room either. It looked like at one time there had been something on the wall, but it had been ripped off. The only other thing I found in there were cigarette butts and old beer cans. Must have been either early 70s or 80s. Like I'd seen from the outside, there was also a place where a window had been removed. Some metal vent was nailed into place to cover the opening. I only had a cheap flashlight with me, and even though it was during the day, the room was pitch black inside. I started to get a real creepy feeling being inside here. The smell was very off. I got out of there and tried to make an excuse for going up to the crawl space. I started moving boxes of old junk up there, so I could tell my parents I was cleaning the garage and had found it. When my parents got home, I made up some story I was putting boxes away and noticed a hole. They didn't get mad or anything. They eventually came clean that the realtor told them about the room. I was like, hey, let's open it up and make this a 6th bedroom in the house. My dad refused, said to just leave it alone. Eventually, some time passed. On occasion, I would take friends up there to see this mystery room. After I opened it up, though, things in the house started to get even creepier. Footsteps going all the time. The ones walking up and down the stairs would be louder. There was more shadows appearing in the shape of people. One time, a family friend screamed because she said she saw a woman in the mirror as she was walking up the stairs. She thought it was my mom, but when she turned, it disappeared. Another time, a friend who was sleeping over in the other room sprinted outside in the middle of the night so scared that he'd gone out in his boxers. Said someone had been standing over him while he was sleeping. When I was about 16, I happened to talk to an older neighbor, and he mentioned that he was one of the original owners in that neighborhood. I asked him about my house. He mentioned something about the son who used to live there going to prison back in the early 70s. Wouldn't go into details, but said it was really sad, and not to let drugs ruin your life. I looked up some old newspapers and stuff in the library, only to find an old article about a teen who'd killed his mother and attempted to kill his father before he was arrested. My family moved out shortly after I turned 17, and I never went back to that house again. When I was around 9 or so, I visited my aunt with my family because we hadn't seen her for a while. We figured visiting her sometime would be nice. My aunt was from my dad's side of the family, and their entire side was super religious Christian. My dad hadn't jumped on this particular bandwagon though. Fast forward a couple of hours of boring car driving. We arrive, we talk to her for a bit, and since her 2 kids and husband were gone because they were going to a Lego convention, it didn't take too long for that little chat to end. After we'd had dinner with her, she asked us if we would be interested in visiting the church across the street. The town she lived in was kinda small, so things were very tidy and together, hence the church literally being right across from her house. We said yes because we figured we didn't really have anything else to do. She smiled and grabbed up her church keys, as she was part of the staff that worked there. After a 5-minute walk or so, we arrived and went inside. Around the time we got there, it was already around 8 p.m., since we'd had dinner pretty late, an hour later than usual, I supposed. Because it was so late, the church was actually closed. Only staff was allowed in there after the open hours, so walking into a closed church at night with all but a couple of lights on was creepy enough on its own already. We arrived in the center part of the church that overlooked the organ. We saw that the priest was still sitting there in one of those praying benches, or however you call them. Our aunt approached the priest, who looked surprised since no one but staff was supposed to be allowed in this time. This meant bringing your family was also not allowed. He didn't seem to make a big deal of it, though. He actually seemed quite happy and insisted on all of us staying for us to look around however much we wanted. My mom and dad told to my brother and I that we were allowed to explore the center part alone. It wasn't that big since this church was cramped into a community building, so there was no real reason to have any concern, it seemed. My first interest was the room in one of the small side towers you were never normally allowed into. I went to go check that out and see what was in there. At this point, the priest began to follow me everywhere. I figured he was just checking up on me to make sure I was not stealing anything or something like that. He walked into the small room with me and started asking me all these weird questions, like, "Are you a virgin?" I was around 9, so of course I was. That's also how I responded as well. He then began to ask me about my sexuality and various things about my personal life. At this point, I started getting creeped out. I asked him why he was asking me all these weird questions about my sexual interests. I had just met this guy. I didn't even know his name. He told me not to question him ever. At this point, he started touching my shoulders and slowly walked up behind me. He started to massage my back. Out of fear, I smacked his hand away. He smacked me on the back of my cheek before grabbing me from behind and dragging me away to the emergency exit in the room. If you're wondering how my parents hadn't seen or heard any of this, they had followed my aunt into the doping room because they had never seen one, and their interest had been piqued. I struggled from this guy's grip. It was a bit hard, but the priest was an old man in his 60s or 70s, so he wasn't really that strong anymore. I sprinted out of the room and headed straight for the exit. As I reached it, though, I found the exit was now locked. Here I was, stuck in the center part of the church, with this creepy priest that wanted to do something bad to me. I quickly sprinted down random rooms on the left side of the hall. Luckily, I managed to find what turned out to be the doping room. My parents were inside, confused. They didn't even believe me when I told them what the priest had done, because I tended to over-exaggerate situations a lot as a child. I insisted on leaving the church right now, so eventually my aunt unlocked the door and we all left. The priest simply walked into the room and returned to his prayer bench, pretending nothing had ever happened. I wanted to confront him, but I knew no one was going to believe me now. It was best to just leave the place as soon as possible. After returning to my aunt's home, we talked for a bit more, but it seemed convincing my family was going to be impossible. I had to just accept the fact they'd never believe me, and bottled up all my emotions. My life has always been surrounded by strange things. My family has a medium bloodline, so my mom and I bonded over the more creepy side of life. A long time ago, when I was around 14 or so, I'm 23 now for reference, my mom, one of my younger brothers, and I were all at home. At the time, my mom was in the U.S. Army, so our family was stationed in Fort Hood, Texas. We had lived there for some time, and had some creepers and whatnot looking through the windows every now and then, before we got our home on base. Being watched might not have been as scary to us as it was for most people. We always seemed to attract those sorts of issues for whatever reason. This time was different, though. You see, for a few weeks, my brother, who was about 10 years old, had been noticing the webcam light was on during weird times. Our computer was in our dining room, which overlooked the kitchen, laundry room, and entrance to the living room. It could also see our back door. It could actually see a good portion of our house, really. We were a fair bit concerned, needless to say. We kept a stern eye on it for a few days. We would notice it just kinda going on and off again at random times. We would check the webcam window to see if it was left on or open or something, but it never was. Being two females and a young boy, we were rightfully a bit startled by this. We put some tape over the camera and forgot about it from then on. Fast forward about a week later. We had noticed the tape was now gone. None of us had taken the tape off ourselves. If we had, we would have put it right back on there. Sure, it might have been my mom to video chat across seas sometimes or something, but she always put it right back. The light was on once more, and no window. Suddenly, once we were all stopping to take a look at it, it switched off. At that point, I knew this was not a glitch or something. Someone was watching us. We decided to make a sign to put in front of it. The sign read, "We know you're here." We put it right in front of where the webcam was staring. We waited and waited and waited. Nothing. I assume they must be gone now, waiting for us to forget about the light and computer so they could continue watching us without further worry. Right when we were about to look away, the light came on once more. My mom and I saw it do so. It stayed on for about 20 seconds, presumably the person reading the sign. Then it shut off. We hoped that would be it. We would be done there. I mean, why keep watching us if we knew they were there? Surely we'd call the police on them or something. Halfway through that thought, though, we heard the backyard gate slam shut. We ran to the window to check what it was, and saw nothing there. We were all too scared to go outside, though. We were used to this sort of thing in the past, but not quite like this. There was silence for 10 seconds, then we heard the gate slam, again and again and again. We were terrified. Whoever was watching us was at our house right now. We began to hear banging on the walls outside. We screamed. Later, we found out no one had even heard anything. More banging from a different end of the house outside, then more from the front. There were multiple people banging as hard as possible from all ends of the house. Keep in mind it was a duplex building, so we were attached to another home, and they still heard none of this. My brother was so terrified he ran and grabbed a baseball bat. We stopped him from going outside though, 'cause, he was only 10. Big sister mode kicked in then. I rounded him up to the laundry room, which was the safest room in the house for immediate danger. As I did so, all of the banging suddenly stopped at once. It was as silent as could possibly be. We were frozen in place, trying our best to listen. Nothing but quiet. As soon as it had started, it was now over. Our webcam lights stopped coming on after that. Needless to say, we always had a piece of tape covering the camera just in case, though, whenever we weren't using it. We never had anything like that happen again. Now and then we hear our back gate close sometimes, but that's probably just the wind. I have to point it out again, however, that we lived on a military base. The only way in was with a military ID card or a visiting pass, which had to be specifically granted. These people, with how quickly they got out of there, had to have been military as well. There was just no way it was a civilian on base. They must have been staying nearby our home, too, to have disappeared so quickly. After that, I was even more scared of my surroundings. I always close shades and cover cameras now. I never want that to ever happen again. I live in an apartment complex that's pretty upscale. It has plenty of standalone buildings with 4 apartments in each, 2 on the ground floor and 2 on the upper floor. The only thing I don't really like is many of the buildings have basements that connect the buildings to each other from the basement doors. All 3 of the other tenants in my building are single girls, and I'm a single man. Usually we all just keep to ourselves. None of us are really friends or really talk to each other. I suppose you could consider us acquaintances at best. I think all 3 of the girls must have had partners or something, because they would usually be gone on most weekends. This incident happened about 4 weeks ago on one such weekend. On Fridays, I'd usually have a few drinks and play some video games, or have a few of my buddies come over for some fun. This particular night, though, I was all alone. I was playing on my Switch and had a few strong beers. I was feeling pretty happy, actually. I was just sitting on the couch in that sort of chill, should I have another or do I go to bed now sort of mood. I was playing on my phone for a moment when I heard a pounding at my door. I froze and sat there, not hearing anything else immediately after. "Who the hell is it?" No answer. More pounding, though, in response. "Hey, who is that?" No answer again. I started to get a bit nervous. Slowly, I got up and approached the door. I looked through my peephole, but nobody was there. Since I couldn't see left or right of the door, though, I was not dumb enough to just open it up and look. I put the chain lock on, which I barely did since it was instinct for me to lock the deadbolt as soon as I walked into my apartment. Nothing else happened for the rest of the night, but I semi-sobered up pretty quick after, and didn't fall asleep for quite a while, even though I knew I was now safe. The next week flew by, and I'd sort of forgotten about the incident by then. Maybe it was just the girl and her boyfriend who lived beneath me or something. They were both potheads, and I'd seen them yelling and laughing in the parking lot multiple times before. Perhaps a prank in good fun or something. Another Friday night, I'm there drinking and playing video games once again. I hear the booming hits on my door once more. This time, I was quite annoyed. "Okay, you're fucking done." I grabbed a knife from the kitchen. As I was grabbing it, I heard the pounding get even fiercer. "Come on, man, get out of here, leave me alone." As I walked toward the door, pounding my feet so they knew I meant business, I flung it open. I heard footsteps going down to the main floor, and I decided to follow. Then I heard them descending into the basement. I stopped when I heard that. There was no way I was going into that pitch-black basement by myself. I ran back to my apartment, locked every lock, and went out onto my porch. I knew in a moment I'd see a light come on in one of the apartments next to mine, for whoever it was must have ran home through those basements. But no lights came on in any of them. It was at 2 a.m. when this happened as well. It turned out everyone else was gone that weekend. Nothing happened last week, but it's the weekend again now, and I'm a little freaked out here all by myself. I hope it doesn't happen again tonight. This time I have a baseball bat right by the door, and I plan on confronting them if it happens again. Wish me luck, I guess. I live in rural Wyoming. I used to live in New York City, so living in the middle of nowhere was quite a big change of pace for me. I quite liked it actually, though. I'd gotten a good job and moved into a nice house with my girlfriend. If you've never been to Wyoming, the best way to describe it is a whole lot of nothing. Lots of empty space, trees, woods, and mountains in some parts. We were driving home from a long night out at about 2 in the morning or so. While we were out, we had been making quite a few sexual innuendos towards one another, and being in the middle of nowhere and at least an hour from home, we decided to pull off to the side of the road into a little nature preserve for some quick fun times. We got into the back seat of my truck together and started making out a bit. Eventually, my girlfriend took her shirt off and more sexual things ensued. We were about 20 minutes into our fun time when we saw lights behind us now. It was quite strange in the first place to see another truck on the road at this hour, let alone in the middle of nowhere. But even worse was that they had stopped just behind us. The truck had its brights on, and it had a light rack on top that made it hard to see. At first, it just stopped behind us. Freaked out, we frantically put our clothes back on. Then the truck backed up, though, and looked like it was going to pull away. We both sighed a bit in relief, but what the truck did next still gives me chills to think about to this day. The truck had backed up, but instead of turning around, it moved and boxed us in. We were parked facing a large tree, with no room to go left or right. Our only way out would have been to back up. Now, this big truck with its brights still on was facing the back window of my own. At this point, my girlfriend was freaking out. I jumped up to the front seat, ready to back us out into this guy's truck if necessary. Out of the corner of my eye, though, I saw a cop now approaching my window. I rolled it down a bit and was actually somewhat relieved. Hi there. Is there a problem, officer?" The cop told me my vehicle matched the description of a vehicle involved in an armed robbery that had just happened nearby. He was going to arrest us both right now. Something about this, though, really didn't seem right. The roads were deserted, and the cop's mannerisms were not lining up. I'm not law enforcement or anything like that, but I do have some family that are. From meeting their co-workers and just generally available knowledge, I could tell something was not right here. Why did he turn his regular lights on like he did, but not his police lights if he was after us? It was almost like he had just wanted to wait there watching us. Then it hit me. I glanced out over the window to behind my truck to look at his own. Now, without the fogged-up windows, I could see his truck clearly. No police lights, no markings, nothing. Just an ordinary truck. I tried to play it cool and asked to see the officer's badge, as I now noticed there was not one on his chest. He told me I had no right to ask for that, and to step out of the vehicle now or he was going to execute me. I knew right then and there that this guy was a phony without a doubt. I started the truck and told my girlfriend, who was still in the back seat, to hold on best she could. I slammed it in reverse and pushed into the front of the guy's truck. It didn't budge for a moment. The man ran back to it in a hurry. I put my truck into four-wheel drive, though, and his started to move out of the way. We pulled out and sped off, pedal to the metal. My girlfriend was freaking out even more, asking all kinds of questions. I had to ignore her in the moment, though, and keep on driving best I could. The man pulled out a few seconds later. I saw him in the rear view, trying to follow us. After a mile, though, he gave up and turned off onto a random side road. I have no clue what the guy intended to do with us if we got into his truck, but I sure am glad I didn't have to find out. We don't go down that road anymore, and that's probably the scariest experience of my life. When I was 17, my room was in the basement. Outside of my room was a hall with 2 utility closets and a bathroom. It opened up to a larger area with a couch, TV, pool table, and a computer desk. At night, after my parents would go to bed, their room was upstairs on the main level, so we had the main level in between us. I would stay up late at night surfing the internet in the main area of the basement. This was a pretty normal evening for me so far. My parents had gone to bed hours ago, and now I was sitting at the computer, lights on. By about 2 a.m., I had had enough and decided to finally go to bed. My room was basically just a really large, long rectangle down there. My bed was set up facing the one window, with a space between that and the foot of my bed, probably about 4 feet or so in between. My TV was on top of my dresser right next to it. I'm sitting there in bed, TV on at super low volume. I was slowly drifting off when I heard what sounded like someone landing on the rocks inside the window well. I couldn't see anything except for a very, very vague silhouette just between the tiny lines of the blinds. I could hear a bit of shuffling around now as well. As I regained my senses, there was no mistaking it. There was a grown man in my window well, feet away from me. I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't get up. I couldn't move at all. I couldn't even bring myself to scream. Something inside me was telling me not to move or do anything, because he might see me and know I was awake, maybe in the same way I was seeing him right now. Somehow I was able to reach over for my remote and quietly turn off the TV. I didn't want any light illuminating my form. I didn't even know if he could actually see me. I could tell he was trying to watch me, though. I wanted to text my parents, but I knew at night they put their phones on silent. I laid there for 10 minutes, my heart just racing. I was sweating, my eyes wide and not moving off this creep squatting down. I could make out his knees bent to the sides of his body. Finally, I decided I need to at least try and call their landline from my cell phone. As slowly as possible, I grabbed my phone and leaned under the covers so he couldn't make out the light. I dialed the number in. Even though I knew the ringing was coming from me, the loud break in the silence really freaked me out. I could hear the ringing of my parents' phone, and I was praying my dad would answer. Luckily, he did. "Dad, there's a man in my window well." I heard him begin hauling ass down the stairs immediately and run across the main floor right above my room. I could hear a scuffle. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" All of a sudden, the dude sprung out of the window well like he was a frog or something. I ran upstairs and ran right into my mom. I was shaking and worried about what had happened to my dad. We got to the door and my mom had already called the police, who she was on the phone with. My dad came back in about a minute later, saying the man had run off, with no way for him to catch him. I couldn't sleep at all that night. I spent the night on my parents' bedroom floor. Of course, the cops couldn't do anything and didn't find anyone. The next morning, we went outside to check out the window well area. I could see where he'd pulled the screen off, and the dust had been wiped away at his eye level. This probably means he was watching me the entire time. There were also visible spots due to the missing dust, where he had obviously used his fingers to try and pry the window open. My parents got a security system soon after, and metal window well covers. Blackout curtains too within the next few days. I never could go down there again at night though, and moved my room back upstairs the very next day. This happened to me when I was in high school. My boyfriend and I would often send texts to each other at night when we were supposed to be asleep. It was mostly harmless, and teenagers stay up later than they're supposed to all the time anyway. I mean, technically neither of us actually had a bedtime. We were 17 years old after all. On school nights though, we were still expected to at least try and get some reasonable amount of sleep each night. This happened after about 1 in the morning or so. The two of us hadn't really been talking that night, as I'd had a lot of homework to get done. It was due pretty soon as well, and that just wouldn't happen if we'd been talking all night. I got a text message from him though, telling me his parents weren't at home. He asked me if I could sneak out of the house and come over to his place to meet up with him. I was half asleep at the moment. I told him it sounded like a lot of fun, but I was way too tired right now. I would have to wait and just see him at school the following day. At first, he kept on trying to change my mind. He told me we could have something to drink together because the liqueur cabinet was not locked. We could have the run of the entire house if I just came over right now. I kept turning him down though. I really was exhausted, and the only thing I could think about was going right to sleep. Then he started begging. I figured he must have been really horny or something, and that was the reason he was so persistent. Normally, he knew that when I said no, I could sometimes change my mind with a little convincing. I didn't blame him too much for continuing to try. I did tell him though that I couldn't that night, and that was that. I would see him the next day. I turned over and very quickly fell asleep. A loud smashing noise woke me up out of my dreams out of nowhere. It took me a moment to clear my head and figure out what was going on around me, but something had just broken my bedroom window. My bed was right next to this window, and now it was covered with shattered glass. I looked out, only to see someone standing outside in the yard. They were wearing dark clothing, and I couldn't make out who it was, but I knew they didn't look familiar in any way. I only saw the figure for a brief moment before he noticed me up in bed and took off running down the street. The next thing I heard was my parents knocking on the door. I told them to come in and they turned on the lights. My dad had to help me get out of bed to avoid getting myself all slashed up by the glass all over the place. My mom called the police, and my dad found a huge rock laying amongst all the glass. When the police came over, after looking around for a bit, they found a phone laying in the yard. I recognized that case right away. It was my boyfriend's phone, and it was the one he had to have been texting me with earlier in the night. I told them about the texts earlier. They immediately assumed my boyfriend had gotten mad at me and broke the window or something. However, I was sure that guy I had seen in the yard running away was not my boyfriend at all. The body shape and size were nothing alike. The police had to go over to their house just to make sure, and surprisingly, no one was home at all. Not even my boyfriend. They found signs of a break-in at the home. When contact was made with my boyfriend's parents, we found out that his grandma had suffered a stroke that night, and the family had rushed to visit her in the hospital. My boyfriend had gone with them, of course. He was in such a hurry, though, that he'd forgotten to bring his phone with him. They were all worried about getting to see his grandma. Whoever had been texting me, later confirmed, was not my boyfriend. Someone had broken into his house and used his phone to try and lure me over alone. There were also things stolen too, which was probably the original reason for the break-in. This is where the whole story gets even creepier. Someone had to know several things in order to do this. They had to know the house was empty, meaning they would likely have had to see the whole family leave. That must mean either someone was casing the place out or they lived in the immediate area close by them. At first, I thought it had to be someone who knew me and knew I was his girlfriend. I guess that could have been figured out just by looking through our messages, though. My boyfriend grew up in that house all his life and knew all of his neighbors as well. Several of them were schoolmates, but there were a couple of houses around occupied by older people. Any of them could have been awake and seen that family leave. A lot of people were questioned by the police, but no one was ever arrested for the break-in, and we never found out who really did it in the end. I used to work at this pizzeria that was only a few blocks away from home. I would always walk there and back because of this. Working there allowed me to meet many different types of people. There were people who were always kind, those who felt very privileged, and those who were in between. There was this one person, though, who would just send a chill right down my spine every time he came in. He always had this weird wide smile the whole time that you could tell was obviously fake. He would grab people by the arm and start ranting about how good the food was. It wasn't so bad because he didn't come in that much, but a part of me always dreaded every time he did. One night I was closing alone, and he happened to be the last person in the dining room. It was already past closing time, the oven off, the front sign turned off, and everything, so no one would be coming in. I had been washing some dishes and headed out to see if he had left yet. He wasn't there, so I just assumed he had gone. I didn't hear the bathroom door open or anything to indicate that he could be hiding somewhere. I went to lock the doors and headed back to finish up with my chores for the night. When I walked back into the kitchen, though, I found him standing right in the middle of it, holding out dishes and asking me if I had been looking for them, if I wanted them to finish my job. I walked up to take them, telling him he had startled me. I did a bit of a fake laugh and said that I had locked the door already, but I would go unlock it now because he needed to leave. As I went to take hold of those dishes, he grabbed my arm and looked me dead in the eyes with his big fake grin, telling me how grateful he was to be alone with me. His grip got even tighter as he whispered that he appreciated the service and that he would be back soon. I was more than uncomfortable in that moment. I just sat his dishes aside and hurriedly shoved him out. As I got down to unlock the lock on the bottom of the door, I felt him grip the top of my head. He looked down at me with that grin again and told me he was very, very grateful once more. I was always such a good worker whenever he was around. He left without further incident, and I locked the door up tight, feeling beyond creeped out. That night I was walking home a bit later on. I had seen him in his car just sitting out in front of the store for a while. I had to take the side exit even, so he wouldn't see me as I started the walk home. He wasn't in immediate sight, but I did see him that night as I walked home. He had parked somewhat down the street from the side entrance and waved to me as I started walking. The next night he parked closer to my house. and waved again with that creepy smile. I began to get a little bit scared. The next night, he wasn't even sitting in his car anymore, but seemed to be patrolling the street looking for me. I ended up heading down a different road and running home. The next 2 days, I tried different ways. On the third, though, he was there right again when I got out of work. He even passed me on my way home a few times, circling around to see which way I would be going. I told my cousin about this, and they started giving me free rides home. I was on vigilant alert for the guy, so I could report him if anything kept happening. He came in a few days after I'd started getting the rides. I found him standing in the kitchen doorway somehow, asking me where I had been since he hadn't seen me in a few days. He made it sound like he had been coming in specifically for me. I just told him I had been very busy. I tried to do a bit of small talk to force him to leave. When he did, I told my coworker everything that had been happening, and she told me if he came back in, she would handle it. The strangest thing is, though, that he never came back in after that last chat we had. I didn't find him stalking in the streets anymore or out in his car waiting for me at night, and he didn't come into my workplace ever again either. He almost seemed to disappear from the world altogether. I was able to start walking home again, and I didn't feel quite so scared closing at night. But I did always have that feeling of dread that he would someday show up again. Somehow he just never did. This story takes place a few years back. I was 16 and my cousin who was with me was 21 at the time. We'll call him Jay. We're rural town boys, never really much to do. Jay and I grew up together, so we were always close, and we always did everything together. One night he decided to stay over at my house with me, while my parents would be out of town. We didn't really do too much though. Had some food and played some video games together. Well, needless to say, it wasn't long before we got kind of bored. In the past, Jay and I had gone out for night walks around the neighborhood, and we would just walk around and talk about things that were bothering us. Girls, school, whatever really came up. That particular night, Jay had suggested that we go for one of our walks. He had quite a lot on his mind at the time, as did I, so this walk was going to be a little longer than the usual ones. I live about 2 miles from our old middle school. However, it's not in the direction of the nearest town, so we don't ever see it. We decided we wanted to roam over that way, just to hang out and talk about the times we'd spent there in the past. Take a little trip down memory lane, you know? When we got there, we looked at the building through the chain link fence for a while. We sat there pointing at different things, telling each other stories about our school days when we were younger. This was about half an hour. By this point, it had to be about 1 in the morning or so. Jay suggested offhand that we hop the fence and sit down at the Ramada, a roofed shelter. It was closer to the school building, but not quite so close to the cameras that were attached to it. I agreed with this idea, as I wasn't tired yet, and I still had a lot more reminiscing to do in my mind. I remember walking over to it, and seeing from the distance that the only camera facing the gym building had been broken. It was hanging down, pointing at the ground. I remember thinking about kids playing wall ball and accidentally throwing a ball up too high on occasion when I was at school. Must have been how it broke. I didn't really think too much of it. Jay and I sat down and talked for quite a while, only for me to realize it was already 2 a.m. now. I was just about to say to him that we should probably start heading back when we heard the loud metal door of the gym suddenly open. There were windows in the doors of the gym, but we had not seen any lights on in there at any point. It was pitch black the entire time, and now someone was emerging from that darkness. We ducked down and peered out over the wall to see who it was that was coming. The school had lights all around the building, but the Ramada did not. We could see him very well, and we were hoping he wouldn't be able to see us. The man that walked out of the gym didn't look like anyone we recognized from our time in the school, nor did he look like he belonged there at all. He was a very dirty, ragged-looking man, long hair about shoulder length. He was wearing a black hoodie and had a mask on as well. We tried as hard as we could not to move or make any noise as we watched this man walk out, take a look up at the sky and take a deep breath, and then walk behind the school's tool shed. Upon getting back there and out of sight, he let out a sound I can only describe as a howling growl, and we heard a loud bang, almost as if he'd just attacked the back of the shed. Jay and I gave each other a very startled look before whispering to each other that we needed to hop a different fence to get out. Surely he would see us jumping the one we had jumped to get in. When we looked back, he was already back by the gym door. We crouched and walked out of there a little ways in silence before we decided to stand up and make a mad dash to a farther out fence. When we got there, we looked back. We didn't see the man anymore. Jay hopped the fence easily, but as I was climbing up, I heard him shout, "Oh shit, hurry up, dude!" He jumped onto the fence and grabbed my jacket to tug me upwards. When I got to the top and was dropping over to the other side, I looked back, only to see the man had circled around and was now a few yards away from us with something in his hand. My skin was crawling. It was a hammer. He stopped when I got over the fence and just stared at the both of us. As we started to jog away in fear, we looked back, only to see him hopping over the fence easily. Upon seeing this, we began to sprint as fast as we could. The man started to gain on us. Thankfully, we took a longer way, with much more twists and turns. We lost him very early on into the chase. I guess he didn't know the area very well. When we got back home, we made sure everything was locked up tight, grabbed one of my dad's guns, and the 2 dogs, and we slept together in my room. Nothing else happened that night, so I'm sure we actually lost him. We never found out why he was there or what he did either. We never went there on a walk ever again. That's for sure. Okay, so for context, I often have trouble sleeping due to poor self-control with devices and social media usage. Today was one of those nights, which just kept dragging on and on. I ended up getting up from my computer to grab something to drink from the kitchen. In the corridor, I had noticed a cockroach and spent some time chasing it, trying to pick it up with a piece of paper and throw it out from our balcony. I ended up losing track of it though when it scampered off behind the sofa, so I gave up at that point and decided to leave it alone. It was at that exact moment when I heard the doorknob to my apartment door twisting downward. I live with 2 other roommates, so I was quite used to the sound of the door being unlocked. But this was not that. Just the creaking metal of the doorknob being pressed down slowly. At first, I thought maybe the sound had even come from my room. I hadn't closed the door, and with most of our balcony's windows being left open at night, we had a bit of a draft which could make doors close and open on their own. Maybe the sound was the metallic hinges swaying on the door from my room. But as I went back to the corridor, I knew that couldn't be what it was. The sound was clearly coming from the main apartment door, and I could visibly see the doorknob slowly press down, then release. This repeated a few times, with somebody seemingly trying to open the door as quietly as possible. A soft, slow press down, then a release. Now a moment of silence. I was absolutely certain there was someone on the outside of the door, but I had no idea who this could be. I briefly considered maybe it was one of my roommates trying to stay quiet because it was so late at night. But for one, they all had their own keys and would thusly be able to unlock the door themselves. And secondly, I remembered seeing them all return much earlier in the evening. If it was one of them, why weren't they saying anything? Something as simple as, "OP, I forgot my keys, please open the door now." My second assumption was that it must be a robber, trying different people's doors in the middle of the night to see if anyone had left theirs open. They'd sneak in and snatch something. That soon turned out to be very unlikely though. I grabbed the doorknob and popped it back up to stop the person on the other side from trying to press it down. Then I shouted through the door, "What the fuck? What the hell are you doing?" I wanted to sound aggressive, but it came out very uneven and sort of pathetic sounding. There was no response. That was already too much. They definitely just heard me. Our walls weren't soundproofed or anything. you could hear clearly in and out of the apartment. This person was now completely aware I was on the other side, but they didn't do anything. Not a word, not a sound of panic or running off after me noticing them. After a moment of silence, they began trying to jiggle the doorknob again. I banged on the door, thinking maybe this person didn't speak English or something, so I should use a threatening non-verbal gesture. That's when the most terrifying part happened. I swear to God, after I did that, I began to hear a soft tapping on the other side of the door. It was quiet and a bit fast, almost like someone drumming their fingers up against it, very different from my own banging. I immediately thought this must be some sort of response to my knocking. Looking back at it now, it's possible I imagined it because I was tired and panicking, but I think I definitely heard something like that. For a moment, I considered settling this matter myself. I went to my room to grab my keys and grabbed a big knife. I was preparing to unlock the door to confront this person, but for some reason, I just couldn't. I was frozen there with fear, and I had the very strong sense that this might be exactly what this person was waiting for. Maybe this was their plan, taunting me with the doorknob and the tapping, waiting for the moment I get angry enough to unlock the door and go outside. So I didn't do that. I stood there holding the knife and yelled through the door once more. "I don't know who you are or what you want, but leave me alone. Stop trying to open our door and fuck off. If you keep trying, I'll call the police." It sounded much weaker and shakier than I wanted it to, unfortunately. Again, there was no response from the other side. There was a moment of silence before the doorknob started being jiggled even fiercer. I called 911 and gave them my address, explaining the situation to the dispatcher. As I was talking, which was audible through the door surely, they didn't move or make any noises. After I hung up the phone, though, I saw the doorknob press down one more time, and a little tug. Then it stopped for good. The last thing of note is that after this, I heard the main door of the apartment block clicking shut. I realized the weirdo must have gone downstairs and exited the building. I rushed out onto the balcony as fast as I could to see if I could catch a glimpse of them while they were leaving. I didn't see anything. They must have either left very quickly or kept close to the wall on the sidewalk to stay out of view. The police arrived shortly after. I had to awkwardly re-explain the situation to them. They asked me if it could have been a drunk or someone trying to get into their own apartment, but that was clearly nonsense. A drunk wouldn't have moved around more and made noise on purpose, while a person trying to get into their own apartment would have tried to key at least, not just press down the doorknob so slowly and deliberately. The police checked every floor and found nobody, so the weirdo had probably took off like I thought. I felt bad for the officers, who looked somewhat indifferent to the whole thing. I apologized a few times for making them come out at such a late hour for such a trivial thing. The whole situation felt so surreal that it kinda made me feel stupid and ridiculous. At some point, I even wondered if maybe it was all in my head. Maybe there was nobody on the other side of the door and I was just hallucinating because of lack of sleep. But no, I'm sure I saw the doorknob move, and I felt the pressure when I held it, of them still trying to open it anyway. I think I heard rustling, either feet shuffling or clothes moving, which was another reason I'm confident there was someone on the other side. In the end, I'm not even sure what the hell happened. If they were a burglar, they would have left the moment they realized someone was awake and monitoring now. Why would they keep on trying to open the door? One press on it and they knew immediately that it was locked. Maybe they were trying to pick the lock or something. But again, why would they do that if they knew I was right there on the other side? A few years ago when I was 11, I'm a girl by the way, and my brother was 6, a new person started being seen in our neighborhood. I know in most places that's not a very big deal, but we lived in a really small town. Everyone knew everyone else, and all the kids played together, even if we were all in different age groups. This guy though, no one had ever seen him before. He was around 40 years old, had long ratty hair, a scruffy face, and a dirty old jacket. Nothing weird happened at first. It was just strange that no one had ever seen this guy before, and now he just started showing up out of nowhere. A few weeks went by. At least once every other day, my friends and I would see him somewhere, just skulking around the neighborhood while we rode our bikes or played tag up and down the streets. We didn't really think too much was strange about it. Then one day though, me, my brother, and two of the older boys in the neighborhood were walking down the train tracks in the woods that stretch behind all of our houses. We knew we could hear someone walking behind us, but everyone went there to walk their dogs throughout the day, so we didn't really care at first. The footsteps kept getting louder and faster though, until finally the oldest boy turned around, only to see that man sprinting in our direction. He told us to run down the path towards his backyard and tried to talk to the guy. The guy just kept on jogging past though, and didn't acknowledge him at all. We ran to the boy's house and told his parents. They called the cops, and shortly after, 2 police officers came, talked to us, and searched around the tracks. They didn't find anyone, but they did find his footprints. He had been running in the other direction, away from the houses. They said we'd done the right thing, and if anything weird happened, to tell adults and call again. A week or so went by, and we didn't see him anymore. Until one day, my brother and I were just playing in the backyard when I heard something out in the woods. I looked over, only to see the man hidden in the bushes watching us. I screamed. My stepdad ran outside, but the guy had already disappeared into the foliage. My stepdad called the police, of course. They came and pretty much said the same thing as before. A few more days went by, and no one had seen him in the meantime. One afternoon, my stepdad took my brother and I out into the woods to go play on this big rope swing that had been there forever. The rope swing was on the opposite side of the tracks from where our house was. We had been playing for quite a while when we heard some footsteps walking down the tracks. They stopped close to the path of the rope swing, and then we heard some rustling out in the bushes. My stepdad grabbed me, told me very calmly and quietly to take my brother and go down a different path that led to the next street, to run to the store that was close by and wait there for him to return. I took my brother with me. Just before we turned around a bend, I looked back just in time to see my stepdad walking out toward the noise. He pulled something out of his jacket and gave it a bit of a flick. It was a big collapsible metal billy club sort of thing. He kept on walking, and we ran to the store. We went inside, and I grabbed some ice cream for my brother and I. I told Linda, the lady who worked there, everything that happened. She told us to go sit down and made a phone call. I thought she called the police at the time, but now I'm not so sure. Thinking about it now, I think she may have actually called my stepdad. She talked to him for a few seconds and hung up. She looked worried, but quite relieved at the same time. She told us to stay put, and everything was going to be okay. About an hour later, my stepdad returned. He hugged us tight, talked to Linda a bit quietly, and then took us home together. When I asked him what happened, all he would say was, "It's all good. Everything's going to be fine now." No one's seen that guy ever since.